Chapter 17 of The False Faces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. The False Faces by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 17. Finesse. The person in the educated evening clothes was made known as Mr. Revel. For Lanyard's benefit and his own he vacated the chair beside Sophie Weringrode, seating himself to one side of Cecelia Brooke, who had Velasco between her and the soi disant Princess. Already a waiter had placed and was filling glasses for Lanyard and the girl. With the best grace he could muster the adventurer sat down, accepted a cigarette from the Weringrode case, and with openly impertinent eyes inspected the intrigante critically. She endured that ordeal well, smiling confidently, a handsome creature with a beautiful body bewitchingly gowned. Time, he considered, had been kind to Sophie. Time, the mysteries of the modern toilette, and the astonishing adaptability of womankind. Splendidly vital, like all of her sort who survive, she seemed mysteriously able to renew that vitality through the very extravagance with which she squandered it. She had lived much of late years rapidly but well, had learned much, had profited by her lessons. To night she looked legitimately the princess of her pretensions. The manner of the grande dame suited her type. Her gesture was as impeccable as her taste. Prettier than ever, she seemed at worst little more than half her age. And her quick intelligence mocked the privacy of his reflections. "Fair, fast, and 40," she interpreted smilingly. He pretended to be stunned. "Never!" he protested feebly. The woman reaffirmed in a series of rapid nods. "Have I ever had secrets from you? You are too quick for me, monsieur. I do not intend to begin deceiving you at this late day. Or trying to." "Flattery," he declared, "is meat and drink to me. Tell me more." She laughed lightly. "Thank you, no. Vanity is unbecoming in men. I do not care to make you vain." Aware that Cecelia Brooke was listening all the while, she seemed to be enchanted with the patter of Mr. Revel and the less vapid observations of Velasco. Lanyard sought to shunt personalities from himself. "And now a princess!" "Did you know I had married?" "Yes, a princess of Spain, and with a castle there, if you must know." "Quite a change of atmosphere from Berlin," he remarked. "But it has done you no perceptible harm." That won him a black look. "Oh, Berlin!" she said with contemptuous lips. "I haven't been there since the beginning of the war. I wish never to see the place again. True, I was born an Austrian, but is that any reason why I should love Germany?" She leaned forward, her fan gently tapping the knuckles of his hand. "Pay less attention to me," she insisted, with a nod toward the middle of the room. "You are missing something. Me, I never tire of her." The floor had been cleared. A drummer on the dais was sounding the long roll crescendo. At the culminating crash the lights were everywhere darkened, save for an orange coloured spotlight set in the ceiling immediately above the dancing floor. Into that circular field of torrid glare bounded a woman wearing little more than an abbreviated kirtle of grass strands with a few festoons of artificial flowers. Applause roared out to her. The orchestra sounded the opening bars of an Americanized Hawaiian melody. The woman with extraordinary vivacity began to perform a denatured hula, a wild and tawny animal, superbly physical, relying with warrant upon the stark sensuality of her body to make amends for the censured phrases of the primitive dance. The floor resounded like a great drum to the stamping of her bare feet, till one marvelled at such solidity of flesh as could endure that punishment. Sophie Weringrode lounged negligently upon the table, bringing her head near Lanyard's shoulder. "Play fair," she said between lips that barely moved. Without looking round, Lanyard answered in the same manner. "Why ask more than you are prepared to give?" "The police ran you out of America once. We need only publish the fact that Mr. Anthony Ember is the Lone Wolf." Well? Leave Berlin out of it before this girl." Lanyard shrugged and laughed quietly. "What else? We can't talk now. Ask me for the next dance." The woman sat back in her chair, attentive to the posturing of the dancer, slowly fanning herself. Lanyard's semblance of as much interest was nothing more; furtively his watchfulness alternated between two quarters of the room. On the farther edge of the circle of tropical radiance he had marked down a table at which two men were seated, Dressier and O'Reilly. No more question now as to the personnel of the conspiracy. Even Velasco had thrown off the mask. The enemy had come boldly into the open, indicating a sense of impudent assurance, indicating even more, contempt of opposition. No longer afraid, they no longer skulked in shadows. Lanyard experienced a premonition of events impending. In addition, he was keeping an eye on the door to the elevator shaft. Once already it had opened, letting a bright window into the farther wall of the shadowed room, discovering the figure of the maître d'hôtel in silhouette, anxiety in his attitude. He was waiting for somebody, waiting tensely. So were the others waiting, all that crew and their fellow workers scattered among the guests. Lanyard told himself he could guess for whom. Only Ekstrom was wanting to complete the circle. When he appeared, if by chance he should, things ought to begin to happen. If tolerably satisfied that Ekstrom would not come, not that night at all events, Lanyard, none the less, continued to be jealously heedful of that doorway. But the hula came to an end without either his vigilance or the impatience of the maître d'hôtel being rewarded. Writhing with serpentine grace to the edge of the illuminated area, the dancer leaped back into darkness and the folds of a wrap held by a maid, in which garment she was seen, bowing and laughing when the lights again blazed up. Without ceasing to play, changing only the time of the tune, the orchestra swung into a fox trot. Lanyard glanced across the table to see Cecelia Brooke rising in response to the invitation of dapper Mr. Revel. In his turn he rose with Sophie Weringrode. "Be patient with me," he begged. "It is long since I danced to music more frivolous than a cannonade." "But it is simple," the woman promised. "Simple, at least, to one who can dance as you could in the old days. Just follow me till you catch the step. It doesn't matter anyway. I desire only the opportunity to converse." Yielding to his arms, she shifted into French when next she spoke. "You do admirably, my friend. Never again depreciate your dancing. If you knew how one suffers at the feet of these Americans." "Excellent," he said. "Now that is settled, what is it you are instructed to propose to me?" She laughed softly. "Always direct. Truly you would never shine as a secret agent." "Not as they shine," Lanyard countered, "in the dark." "Don't be a fraud. We are what we are, and so are you. Let us not begin to be censorious of one another's methods of winning a living." "Agreed. But when do we begin to talk business?" "Why do you continue so persistently antagonistic?" "I am French." "That is silly. You are an outlaw, a man without a country. Why not change all that?" "And how does one effect miracles?" "Germany offers you a refuge, security, freedom to ply your trade unhindered, within reasonable limits." "And in exchange what do I give?" "Your services, as and when required, in our service." "Beginning when?" "To night." "With what specific performance?" "We want, we must without fail have, that document you took from the Brooke girl." "Perhaps we had better continue in English. You are speaking a tongue unknown to me." "Don't talk rot. You know well what I mean. We know you have the thing. You didn't steal it to turn it over to England or the States. What is your price to Germany?" "Whatever you have in mind, believe me when I say I have nothing to sell to the Wilhelmstrasse." "But what else can you do with it? What other market?" "My dear Sophie, upon my word I haven't got what you want." "Then why so keen to get the Brooke girl on the telephone as soon as you found out where she was stopping?" "How did you learn about that, by the way?" "Let the credit go to Señor Velasco. He saw you first." One thought as much. Nevertheless, I haven't what you want." "You gave it back to Miss Brooke?" "Having nothing to give her, I gave her nothing." The woman was silent throughout a round of the floor. Then, "Tell me something," she requested. "Can I keep anything from you?" "Are you in love with the English girl?" Lanyard almost lost step, then laughed the thought to derision. "What put that into your pretty head, Sophie?" "Do you know it yourself, my friend?" "It is absurd." She laughed maliciously. "Think it over. Possibly you have not stopped to think as yet. When you know the truth yourself, you will be the better qualified to fib about it. Also, you will not forget—" "What?" he demanded bluntly as she paused with intention. "That as long as she possesses the document, since you have it not, her life is endangered even more than yours." "She hasn't got it," Lanyard declared, as nearly in panic as he ever was. "Ah!" the woman jeered. "So you confess to some knowledge of it, after all!" "My dear," he said teasingly, "do you really want to know what has become of that paper?" "I do, and mean to." "What if I tell you?" Her eyes lifted to his in childlike candour. "Need you ask?" "You are irresistible. Ask Karl." She demanded sharply: "Whom?" "Ekstrom." "Ah!" Again the adventuress was silent for a little. "What does he know?" "Ask him. Enquire why he murdered von Harden, then what business took him to 95th Street twice this evening, once about 9 o'clock, again at midnight." "You must be mad, monsieur. Karl would not dare—" "You don't know him, or have forgotten he was trained in the International Bureau of Brussels, and there he learned how to sell out both parties to a business that won't bear publicity." "I wonder," the woman mused. "Never have I wholly trusted that one." "Shall I give you the key?" "If you love Karl as little as I—" "But where do you suppose the good man is, this night of nights?" "Who knows? He was not here when I arrived at midnight. I have seen nothing of him since." "When you do, if he shows himself at all, look him over carefully for signs of wear and tear." "Yes, monsieur? And in what respect?" "Look for cuts about his head and hands, possibly elsewhere. And should he confess to an affair with a wind shield in a motor accident, ask him what happened to the study window in the house at 95th Street." Impish glee danced in the woman's eyes. "Your handiwork, dear friend?" "A mere beginning. You may tell him so, if you like." He was subjected to a convulsive squeeze. "Never have I felt so kindly disposed toward an enemy. It is true, I were a better foe to Germany if I kept my counsel and let Ekstrom continue to play double." The music ceasing, to be followed by the inevitable clamour for more, Lanyard offered an arm upon which Sophie rested a detaining hand. "No, wait. We dance this encore. I have more to say." He submitted amiably, the more so since not ill pleased with himself; and when again they were moving round the floor, she bore more heavily upon his shoulder and was thoughtful longer than he had expected. Then: "Attention, my friend." "I am listening, Sophie." "If what you hint is true, and I do not doubt it is, Karl's day is done." "More nearly than he dreams," Lanyard affirmed grimly. "I shan't be sorry. I am German through and through. What I do for the Fatherland, and in that find absolution for many things I care not to remember. If through what you tell me I may prove Karl traitor, I owe you something." "Always it has been my fondest hope, Sophie, some day we have you in my debt." Her fingers tightened on his. "Do not jest in the shadow of death. Since you have been unwise enough to venture here to night, you will not be permitted to leave alive, unless you pledge yourself to us and prove your sincerity by producing that paper." "That sounds reasonable. Like Prussia. What next?" "I have warned you, so paid off my debt. The rest is your affair." "Do you imagine I take this seriously?" "It will turn out seriously for you if you do not." "How can I be prevented from leaving when I will, from a public restaurant?" "Is it possible you don't know this place? It is maintained by the Wilhelmstrasse." Attempt to leave it without coming to a satisfactory understanding, and see what happens." "What, for instance?" "The lights would be out before you were half across the room. When they went up again, the Lone Wolf would be no more, and never a soul here would know who stabbed him or what became of the knife." "Are you by any chance amusing yourself at my expense?" Once more the woman showed him her handsome eyes. He found them frankly grave, earnest, unwavering. "If you will not listen, your blood be on your own head. Forgive me. I didn't mean to be rude. Still, you do not believe. You are wrong. I am merely amused. If you understand, you would never mock your peril. But I don't mock it. I am enchanted with it. I accept it, and it renews my youth. This might be Paris of the days when you ran with the pack. Sophie. And I alone." The woman moved her pretty shoulders impatiently. "I think you are either mad or the very soul of courage." The encore ended, they returned to the table, Sophie leaning lightly on Lanyard's arm, chattering gay inconsequentialities. Dropping into her chair, she bent over towards Cecelia Brooke. "He dances adorably, my dear," the intrigante declared. "But I dare say you know that already." The English girl shook her head, smiling. "Not yet." "Then lose no time. You two should dance well together, for you are more of a size. I think the next number will be a waltz. We get altogether too few of them. These American dances, these one steps and fox trots, they are not dances, they are mere romps, favorites none the less. And there is always more room on the floor. So few waltz nowadays. Really, you must not miss this opportunity." This playful insistence, the light stress she had laid upon her suggestion that Cecelia Brooke dance with him, considered in conjunction with her recent admonition, impressed Lanyard as significantly inconsistent. Sophie was no more a woman to make purposeless gestures than she was one sufficiently wanting in finesse to signal him by pressures of her foot. There was sheer intention in that iteration: "Lose no time. You must not miss this opportunity." Something had happened even since their dance. She had observed something momentous, and was warning him to act quickly if he meant to act at all. With unruffled amiability, amused, urbane, Lanyard bowed his petition across the table, and was rewarded by a bright nod of promise. Lighting another cigarette, he lounged back, poised his wineglass delicately, with the eye of a connoisseur appraised its pale amber tint, touched it lightly to his lips, inhaling critically its bouquet, sipped, and signified approval of the vintage by sipping again, all without missing one bit of business in a scene enacted on the far side of the room, directly behind him, but reflected in a mirror panel of the wall he faced. The diplomatist charged with the task of discriminating the sheep from the goats in the lower lobby had come up to confer with his colleague, the maître d'hôtel of the upper story. When Lanyard first saw the man, he was standing by the elevator shaft, none too patiently awaiting the attention of the other, who, caught by inadvertence at some distance, was moving to join him, with what speed he could manage threading the thick set tables. Was this what Sophie had noticed? Had she likewise, perhaps, received some secret signal from the guardian of the lower gateway? A signal possibly indicating that Ekstrom had arrived. They met at last, those two, and discreetly confabulated, the maître d'hôtel betraying welcome mitigation of that nervous tension which had heretofore so palpably affected him. And, as the other stepped back into the elevator, Lanyard saw this one's glance irresistibly attracted to the table dedicated to the service of the Princess Dalavia. Something much resembling satisfaction glimmered in the fellow's leaden eyes. It was apparent that he anticipated early relief from a distasteful burden of responsibility. Then, at ease in the belief that he was unobserved, he turned to a nearby table round which four sat without the solace of feminine society. Four men whose stamp was far from reassuring despite their strikingly quiet demeanour and inconspicuously correct investiture of evening dress. Two were unmistakable sons of the Fatherland. All were well set up, with the look of men who would figure to advantage in any affair calling for physical competence and courage. From coffee and pistols at sunrise in the Parc aux Princes to a battle royal in a Tenderloin dive. Their table commanded both ways out, by the stairs and by the elevator, much too closely for Lanyard's peace of mind; and more than one looked thoughtfully his way while the maître d'hôtel hovered above them, murmuring confidentially. Four nods sealed an understanding with him. He strutted off with far more manner than had been his at any time since the arrival of Lanyard, and vented an excess of spirits by berating bitterly an unhappy clown of a waiter for some trivial fault. The first bars of another dance number sang through the confusion of voices. Truly, as Sophie had foretold, a waltz. End of chapter 17. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 18 of The False Faces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. The False Faces by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 18. Dance Macabre. Trained in the old school of the dance, Lanyard was unversed in that graceless scamper which today passes as the waltz, with a generation largely too indolent or too inept of foot to learn to dance. His was that flowing waltz of melting rhythm, the waltz of yesterday, that dance of dances, to whose measures a civilization more sedate in its amusements, less jealous of its time, danced, flirted, loved, and broke its hearts. Into the swinging movement of that antiquated waltz Lanyard fell without a qualm of doubt, all ignorant as he was of his benighted ignorance; and instantly, with the ease and gracious assurance of a dancer born, Cecelia Brooke adapted herself to his step and guidance, with rare pliancy made her every movement exquisitely synchronous with his. No need to lead her, no need for more than the least of pressures upon her yielding waist, no need for anything but absolute surrender to the magic of the moment. Effortless, like creatures of the music adrift upon its sounding tides, they circled the floor, once, twice, and again, before, reluctantly, Lanyard brought himself to shatter the spell of that enchantment. Looking down with an apologetic smile, he asked: "Mademoiselle, do you know you can be an excellent actress?" As if in resentment, the girl glanced upward sharply, with clouded eyes. "So can most women in emergency." "I mean, I have something serious to say. Nobody must guess your thoughts." She said simply: "I will do my best." You must appear quite charmed. Also, should you catch me smirking, like an infatuated ninny, remember I am only doing my own indifferent best to act." Laughter trembled deliciously in her voice. "I promise faithfully to bear in mind your heartlessness." "I am an ass," he enunciated with the humility of conviction, "but that can't be helped. Attend to me, if you please, and do not start. This place turns out to be a nest of Prussian spies. I was brought here by a trick. I understand the order as I may not leave alive." Playing her part so well as almost to embarrass Lanyard himself, the girl smiled daringly into his eyes. "Because of that packet?" she breathed. "Because of that, mademoiselle." "Where is it?" For an instant Lanyard lost countenance absolutely. Through sheer good fortune the girl was now dancing with face averted, her eyes so nearly touching his shoulder that it seemed to rest upon it. Nevertheless, it was at cost of an heroic struggle that he fought down all signs of that shock with which he had been borne in upon him, that he dared not assure the girl her packet was in safe hands. If he had failed in his efforts to restore the thing to her, that she might consign it as she saw fit and so discharge her personal trust, till now Lanyard had solaced himself with the hazy notion that she would in turn be comforted when she learned the document was in the keeping of her country's secret service. Impossible to tell her that his own act had rendered it impossible, that act the outcome of wilful trifling with his infirmity, his itch for thieving. Of a sudden the pilfered necklace secreted in an inner pocket of his waistcoat, above his heart, seemed to have gained the weight of so much lead. The hideous consciousness of the thing stung like the bite of live coals. This woman was in distress. He yearned to lighten her burden. He could do that with half a dozen words. His guilt prohibited. A thief! Now indeed the Lone Wolf tasted shame and realized its bitterness. Puzzled by his constraint, the girl's eyes again sought his, and warned in time by the movement of her head, he mustered impudence to meet their question with a look of tenderness that went with the role she suffered him to play. "What is the matter?" "I am ashamed that I have failed you." "Don't think of that. I know you did your best. Only tell me what became of it." "It was stolen. When I returned to my stateroom that night I was held up and robbed. The thief shot at me, killed his confederate, decamped by way of the port. I pursued. Another aided him to overpower and cast me overboard." "Yet you escaped." Strange she should seem more intrigued by that than concerned about her loss. "I escaped. No matter how. You don't know who stole the packet?" "I don't recall the man among the passengers, but he may have been in one of the boats. A fellow of about my stature, with a flowing beard." He sketched broadly Ekstrom as he had seen him in the Stanistreet library. Her eyes quickened. "One such escaped in our boat, the second steward. I think his name was Anderson." "Doubtless the same." "Then it is gone." For once in his acquaintance with her, that brave spirit seemed to falter. She became a burden, bereft for a little of all grace and spontaneity. He was constrained to swing her forcibly into time. Almost instantly she recollected herself, covered her lapse with a little laugh innocent of any hint of its forced falsity, and showed him and the room as well a radiant countenance, all with such address and art that the incident might well have escaped notice, otherwise have passed for a bit of natural by play. Yet distress was too eloquent in the broken query, "What am I to do?" Heartsick, self-sick to boot, he essayed to suggest that she consult Colonel Stanistreet, but lacking so much effrontery, stammered and fell silent. Perhaps misinterpreting, she cried in quick contrition, "I am forgetting. Forgive me. I should have said, what are you to do?" He whipped his wits together. "Look down, turn your face aside, smile. I have a plan, a desperate remedy, but the best I can contrive. When next the lift comes up we must try to be near it. There is one row of tables which we must break through by main force. Leave that to me. Follow as I clear a way. Go straight into the lift. If anything happens, run down the stairway on the left. The ground floor is 2 flights below. If I am any way detained, don't stop. Go on, get your wraps, take the first taxi you see, return directly to the Knickerbocker. I will telephone you later." "If you live," she breathed. "Never fear for me. But if I do? Do you imagine I could rest if I thought you had sacrificed yourself for me?" "You must not think that. I am far too selfish." "That is not so, and I refuse positively to do as you wish unless you tell me how I may communicate with you." Resigned to humor her, he recited his address and the number of the house telephone, and when she had memorized both by iteration, resumed: "Once outside, if anybody tries to hinder you, don't let them intimidate you into keeping quiet, but scream, scream at the top of your lungs. These beasts abominate a screaming woman, or any other undue noise. Not only will that frighten them off, but it will fetch the nearest policeman." The music ceased. She stood flushed, smiling, adorably pretty, eyes starlike for him alone. "We are not far from the lift now," she said just audibly. "But the door is shut. Hush, here comes the encore. Once more around." They drifted again into that witching maze of melody and movement made one. "You are silent," she said after a little. "Why?" Lanyard answered with a warning pressure on her hand. The elevator was stationary at the floor, its door wide, the maître d'hôtel engaged in a far quarter of the room, while those 4 formidable guardians of the exit were gossiping with animation over their glasses. "Steady. Now is our time." Abruptly they stopped. A couple that had been following them avoided collision by a close margin. Over his partner's head the man scowled portentously, and dissipated his display of temper on Lanyard's indifferent back. Upon those guests who sat between the dancing floor and elevator Lanyard wasted no consideration. Pushing roughly between two adjoining tables, he lifted one chair with its astonished occupant bodily out of the way, then turned, swung an arm round the girl's waist, all but threw her through the lane he had created, followed without an instant's pause. It was all so quickly accomplished that the girl was in the car before another person in the room appreciated what was happening; and Lanyard, in the act of slamming the door shut without heed for the protesting operator, saw only a room full of amazed faces with gaping mouths and rounded eyes, and one man of the four at the near by table in the act of rising uncertainly with a stupefied look. Elbowing the boy aside, he seized the operating lever and thrust it to the notch labeled "Descend." An instant of pause followed; like its attendant, the elevator seemed stalled in inertia of stupefaction. Beyond the door somebody loosed an infuriated screech. Angry hands drummed on the glass panel. With a premonitory shudder the car started spasmodically, moved downward at first gently, then with greater speed, coming to an abrupt stop at the street level with a shock that all but threw its passengers from their feet. Up the shaft that senseless punishment of the panel continued. Some other intelligence conceived the notion for ringing for the car to return. Its annunciator buzzed stridently, continuously. Unlatching the lower door, Lanyard threw it back, stepped out, finding the lobby deserted but for a simpering group of coat room girls, to one of whom he flipped a silver dollar. "Find this lady's wraps. Be quick!" Deftly catching the coin, the girl snatched the check from Cecelia Brooke and darted into the women's dressing room. Throughout a wait of agonizing suspense, the elevator boy remained cowering in a corner of the car, staring at Lanyard as at some shape of terror, while the ignored buzzer droned without cessation to persistent pressure from above. Out of the dark entrance to the lower dining room the bearded diplomatist popped with the distracted look of a jack in the box about to be ravished of its young. "Monsieur is not leaving?" he expostulated shrilly, darting forward. Lanyard stopped him with a look whose menace was like a kick. "I am seeing this lady to her cab," he said in a cold and level voice. The coat room girl emerged from her lair with an armful of wraps and furs. Again the bearded one made as if to block the doorway. "But, monsieur mademoiselle!" Lanyard caught the fellow's arm and sent him spinning like a top. "Out of the way, you rat!" he snapped; then to the girl: "Be quick!" As she shouldered into a compartment of the revolving door, incoherent yells began to echo down the staircase well. At length it had occurred to those above to utilize that means of descent. Wedged in the wheeling door, a final glimpse of the lobby showed Lanyard the startled, putty like mask of the maître d'hôtel at the head of the stairway with, beyond him, the head of one who, though in shadow, uncommonly resembled Ekstrom, but Ekstrom as he was in the old days, without his beard. That picture passed like a flash on a cinema screen. They were on the sidewalk, and the girl was running toward a taxicab, the only vehicle of its sort in sight, at the curb just above the entrance. Coatless and bareheaded, Lanyard swung to face the door porter, a towering, brawny animal in livery, self confident and something more than keen to interfere; but his mouth opened to utter some sort of protest, shut suddenly without articulation when Lanyard displayed for his benefit a .22 Colt's automatic, and he fell back smartly. Jerking open the cab door, the girl stumbled into the far corner of the seat. The motor was churning in promising fashion, the chauffeur settling into place at the wheel. Into his hand Lanyard thrust a $10 bill. "The Knickerbocker," he ordered. "Stop for nobody. If followed, steer for the nearest policeman. There'll be no change." He closed the door sharply, leaned over it, dropped the little pistol into the girl's lap. "Chances are you won't want that, but you may." She bent forward quickly, eyes darkly lustrous with alarm, and placed a hand upon his arm. "But you?" "It is I whom they want, not you. I won't subject you to the hazard of my company." Gently Lanyard lifted the hand from his sleeve, brushed it gallantly with his lips, released it. "Good night!" he laughed. then stepped back, waved a hand to the chauffeur. "Go!" The taxicab shot away like a racing hound unleashed. With a sigh of relief, Lanyard gave himself wholly to the question of his own salvation. The rank of waiting motor cars offered no hope; all but one were private town cars and limousines operated by liveried drivers. A solitary roadster at the head of the line tempted and was rejected, even though it had no guardian chauffeur. Something of which he could not be sure: he would be overhauled before he could start the motor and get the knack of its gear shift mechanism. Even now Au Printemps was in frantic eruption, its doors ejecting violently a man at each wild revolution. Down Broadway an omnibus of the Fifth Avenue line lumbered, at no less speed than 20 miles an hour, without passengers and sporting an illuminated "Special" sign above the driver's seat. Dashing out into the roadway, Lanyard launched himself at the narrow platform of the unwieldy vehicle and, in spite of a yell of warning from the guard, landed safely on the step and turned to repel boarders. But his manoeuvre had been executed too swiftly and unexpectedly. The group before Au Printemps huddled together in ludicrous inaction, as if stunned. Then one raged through it, plying vicious elbows. As he passed against the light, Lanyard identified unmistakably the silhouette of Ekstrom. So that one had, after all, escaped the net of his own treachery! The 'bus guard was shaking Lanyard's arm with an ungentle hand. "Here, now, you got no business boardin' a special." From his pocket Lanyard whipped the first bank note his fingers encountered. "Divide that with the chauffeur," he said crisply. "Tell him to drive like the devil. It's life or death with me." The protruding eyeballs of the guard bore witness to the magnitude of the bribe. "You're on!" he breathed hoarsely, and ran forward through the body of the conveyance to advise the driver. Swarming up the curved stairway to the roof, Lanyard dropped into the rear seat, looking back. The group round the doorway was recovering from its stupefaction. Three struck off from it toward the line of waiting cars. Of these the foremost was Ekstrom. Simultaneously the 'bus, lumbering drunkenly, lurched into Columbus Circle, and the roadster left the curb, carrying in addition to the driver's two passengers, Ekstrom on the running board. Tardily Lanyard repented of that impulse which had moved him to bestow his one weapon upon Cecelia Brooke. The night air had a biting edge. A chill rain had begun to drizzle down in minute globules of mist, which both lent each street light its individual nimbus of gold and dulled deceitfully the burnished asphaltum, rendering its surface greasy and treacherous. More than once Lanyard feared lest the 'bus skid and overturn, and before the old red brick building between Broadway and Eighth Avenue shut out the western sector of the Circle, he saw the roadster, driven insanely, shoot crabwise toward the curb, then answer desperate work at the wheel and whirl madly, executing a volte-face so violent that Ekstrom's hold was broken and he was hurled a dozen feet away. And Lanyard's chances were measurably advanced by the delay required in order to pick up the sprawling one, start the engine anew, and turn more cautiously to resume the pursuit. Striking diagonally across Broadway, the 'bus swung into 57th Street at the moment when the roadster turned the corner of Columbus Circle. The head of the guard lifted above the edge of the roof. Clinging to the supports of the stairway, he addressed Lanyard in accents of blended suspicion and respect. "Listen, boss, is this all right on the level now?" "Absolutely, unless that racing car catches up with us, in which case you'll have a dead man myself on your hands." "Well, we don't want to lose our jobs, that's all." "You won't unless I lose my life." "Anything you'd like me to do?" "Go down, wait on the platform. If anybody attempts to get aboard, kick him in the act." "Sure I will." The guard disappeared. Wallowing like a barge in a strong seaway, the omnibus crossed Seventh Avenue and sped downhill toward Sixth with dangerous momentum. Shortly, however, this began to be modified by the brakes, a precaution against mishap which even the fugitive must approve. Ahead loomed the gaunt structure of the Sixth Avenue L, bridging the roadway at so low an elevation as to afford the omnibus little more than clear headroom. Once beneath it, a single bounce up from the surface car tracks must mean a wreck. but the pursuit was less than half a block astern and gaining swiftly, even as the speed of the omnibus was growing less and desperately less. At what seemed like better than a snail's pace it began to pass beneath the span of the elevated. Like a racing thoroughbred, the roadster swept up alongside, motor chanting triumphantly, running board level with the platform step. Ekstrom, poised to leap aboard, hesitated. A pistol in his hand exploded. A shattered window fell crashing. There was a yell from the guard, not of pain but of fright. Apparently he executed a von Hindenburg retreat. Without more opposition Ekstrom gained the platform. In the same breath Lanyard stood up. The lowermost girder of the L was immediately overhead. He grasped it, doubled his legs beneath him, swung clear. The omnibus shot from under him, the roadster convoying. Drawing himself up, he seized a round iron upright of guard rail and heaved his body in over the edge of the platform round the switching tower, which was at this hour dark and untenanted. In the street below a police whistle shrieked, and a fusillade of pistol shots woke scandalized echoes. Bending almost double, Lanyard moved rapidly northward on the footway beside the western tracks, and so gained the old station on the west side of 58th Street, for years dedicated to the uses of desuetude. Through this he crept, then down the stairs, encountering at the lower landing an iron gate which obliged him to climb over and jump. Not a soul paid the least attention to this matter of gentlemen in evening dress, without hat or top coat, dropping from the stairway of a disused elevated station at 2 o'clock in the morning. In New York anything can happen, and most things do, without stirring up meddlesome impulses in innocent bystanders. End of chapter 18. Recording by William Tomko.
Chapter 19 of The False Faces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April Gonzalez. The False Faces by Louise Joseph Vance. Chapter 19. Force Majeure. This visit to his rooms was the briefest of the several Lanyard made that night, consideration of the mortal urgency dictating its drastic abbreviation. If the events of the last few hours had meant anything whatever, they had demonstrated two truths which shone like beacon lights: that Manhattan Island was overpopulated as long as both he and Ekstrom remained on it; that Ekstrom had been goaded to the verge of aberration by discovery that Lanyard had come safely through the Assyrian debacle to take up anew with the self-appointed office of the Nemesis, to the Prussian spy system in general, and to the genius of its American bureau in particular. Henceforth one would know no more where Slan Lanyard lived. Thus that little street-level apartment forfeited whatever attraction it originally had possessed in the adventurer's estimation. Not only was the address known to Ekstrom associates, and so open to him, but its peculiar characteristics, its facilities for access from the street direct, rendered it a highly practicable death trap for a hunted man. Lanyard was well persuaded he need only wait there long enough to receive a deputation from 79th Street, and with any assurance that Ekstrom would come alone, he might have been content to wait. Not only had he through too intimate acquaintance with his methods every assurance that Ekstrom would never brave alone what he could induce another to risk with him, but Lanyard was never one willing to play the passive part. A banal axiom of all warfare applied: the advantage is with him who fights upon the offensive. Since midnight the offensive had shifted from Lanyard's grasp to the enemy's. He was determined to recapture it, and that was something never to be accomplished by sitting still and waiting for events to unfold, but only by carrying the war into the enemy's camp. He delayed, then, only long enough to change his clothing and to conceal about him certain properties which it seemed unwise to expose to chance discovery on the part of Ekstrom, or in the ever possible event of police intervention. Within 5 minutes from the time of his return he was closing behind him the private door, wearing a quiet lounge suit but no top-coat, with a heart not so soft as to lack character but soft enough to stick upon one's head in time of action, and carrying a stick neither brutishly stout nor ineffectively slender, he strolled up to Seventh Avenue, turned north, entered Central Park, and strolled no more. Kindly shadows enfolded him, engulfed him altogether. 1 minute after he had passed through the gateway he would have defied unaided apprehension by the most zealous officer of the peace. He went swiftly and secretly, avoiding all lighted ways. Not till did conscience stir and remind him of his slighted promise to call up Cecilia Brooke. No time for that. The errand that engaged him was of a nature to brook no more procrastination. The girl must wait. He was sorry if, as she had protested, solicitude of his welfare must interfere with the night's rest. But what must be, must. Until he saw the end of his adventure, he could be influenced by no minor consideration whatsoever. Not that he seriously believed Cecilia's sleep would be uneasy because of him. That was too much. His temper was grim and sceptical. The resentment roused by the trap that had so nearly laid him by the heels, together with the subsequent effort to assassinate him out of hand, had settled into a phase of smouldering fury, whose heat consumed like misty vapours every lesser emotion, every humane consideration. Some by-thought recalling the Waring-Gross innuendo that he was in love without his knowledge, moved him to laugh outright if strangely, an unpleasant laugh that held as much of pain as of derision. What room in that dark heart of his for love? The heart of a thief and a potential assassin? The heart of the lone wolf? How was he to know he had hardly left his lodgings before their hush was interrupted by the grumble of the house telephone? Intermittently for upward of 3 minutes that sound persisted. When at length it discontinued the quiet of the untenanted room reigned undisturbed for a brief time only. An odd metallic stridor became audible, a succession of scrapings of stealthy accent at the private entrance. Its latch clicked. The door swung back against the wall with a muffled bump. 2 pairs of furtive feet padded in the little private hallway. The flash of an electric hand lamp flickered hither and yon like a searching poignard. Picked out of the door to one bedchamber and vanished. There was guarded whispering, then a thud as one of the intruders gained in the middle of the bedchamber in a bound. An instant later a switch snapped, and the room was flooded with light. Beneath the chandelier stood a man in evening dress, the worse for misadventure, one knee on his trousers cut open, both legs caked with a film of half-dry mud, his linen dingy with mud stains, his top coat shockingly bedraggled. He was bareheaded, apparently having lost his hat. A black smear across one cheek added emphasis to the pallor of newly shaven jowls, and his eyes were blazing. "Stole away," he muttered briefly in disgust, then called "Ed." As quietly as a shadow a second man joined him, greeting him with a "Hush!" This gentleman was in far more presentable repair and a more equable frame of mind. There was even a glint of amusement in his hard blue eyes. His countenance had an Irish cast. "Hush?" the other iterated with contempt. "What for? The hound's not here." "No, Karl," Ed admitted, "but there are others in the house. If it's known to them that Lanyard's out, they may turn in a police alarm. And I for one have enough of balls for one night." Karl grunted disdainfully. "I told you this would be a waste of time." "And I agree with you entirely. But you would come. Lanyard's no such fool as to stick around a place he knows I know about." Karl's hand twitched and his features worked nervously. "He knows me too well. Knows that if ever I lay hands on him again..." His voice was rising to an hysterical pitch when the other checked him with a sibilant hiss. At the same time his hand darted out and switched off the light. Karl uttered a startled ejaculation. "Sh!" his companion repeated. In the street a motor car was rumbling, stationary before the door. Then the remote grinding of the house doorbell was heard. "Let's get out of this," suggested the Irishman. "It's no good waiting, anyway." "Hold hard. We won't go till we have a clear field." The Prussian stole out of the sitting room and stood listening to the door to the public hallway, his companion standing by with a mutinous air. "Oh, come along," he insisted, in a stage whisper. "Shut up. Listen." Shuffling footfalls traversed the hallway. The front door was opened. The clear voice of an Englishwoman was answered in the slurring patois of a negro. "No, he ain't in." The next inquiry was intelligible. The speaker had entered the hallway. "Are you sure?" "Yes'm. Somebody done called him up 'bout 10 minutes ago, and I rung and he done answer, and I ain't in or don't mean to answer nobody, that's all. I am very anxious about him. Have you a key to his rooms?" "Yes'm. I got a pass key, but—" "Please use it. Take this. Go in and make sure he's out, or if at home that he is all right." "Yes'm. Thank you, ma'am, but—" "Do as I tell you. I will see that you don't get into trouble." "All right, mum." The negro chuckled, probably over his tip. "You sure as get persuading this way." The Irish caught the German's arm. "Come out of this," he pleaded. "No fear. I'll see it through. That's the broke girl the fool got in with on the boat. She may know something. But leave this to me. You look out for the negro. I'll take care of Miss Cecilia Brooke." Swearing unhappily, the Irishman flattened against the wall to one side of the door. Karl waited behind it as it admitted the hall attendant, who made directly toward the central chandelier. "You just wait, mum, and I'll make a light and—" But the girl had impetuously followed him in. The light went up, and Karl put a heavy shoulder against the door, closing it with a slam. The negro turned and stood with gaping mouth and staring eyes, dumb with terror. The girl recognized Karl with a little cry, and darted back toward the door. Immediately he caught her in his arms. Her lips opened, but their utterance was stifled by a handkerchief thrust between them, with the dexterity of a practised hand. Without one word of warning, the Irishman stepped forward and struck the negro brutally in the face. The boy reeled, whimpering. Two more blows delivered with murderous ferocity silenced him altogether. He collapsed like a broken puppet, insensible on the floor, his face a curious ashen color beneath his glossy skin of brown. End of chapter 19. Recording by April Gonzalez in Cavite, Philippines.
Chapter 20 of The False Faces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Mattingly. The False Faces by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 20. Riposte. The drizzle had grown thicker, the night blacker, the early morning air still more chill. But Lanyard was moving too swiftly to be affected by this last circumstance. The first he anathematized with the perfunctory bitterness of a skilled artisan who sees his work in a fair way to be obstructed by elemental depravity. Another of his trade would have termed such weather conditions ideal, and so might the lone wolf on an everyday job, but the prospect of a footing rendered insecure by rain trebled the hazards attending a plan of campaign that would brook neither revision nor delay. There was only one way to break into the house on 79th Street. This Lanyard had appreciated upon his first reconnaissance of the previous afternoon. He could have wished for more time in which to prepare and assemble tested equipment, instead of relying upon chance to supply the requisite gear, but with all time at his disposal, the mechanical difficulties of the problem would remain. Far from indifferent to these, Lanyard addressed himself to their conquest doggedly and with businesslike economy of motion. Shunning the public paths, he went over the park wall like a cat, sped across town through 80th Street, and so came to that plot of land upon which an apartment building was in process of erection, immediately to the north of the American headquarters of the Prussian spy system. Walled in with stone 2 stories deep, its gaunt skeleton of steel had been joined together as far as the 7th level. How much higher it was destined to rise was immaterial. For Lanyard's purpose it was enough that the frame had already outgrown its neighbour on the south. A litter of lumber, huge steel girders and other material narrowed the side streets to half its normal width. The sidewalk space was trampled earth, roofed with heavy planks for the protection of pedestrian heads. A passage lighted by electric bulbs widely spaced. Midway in this, an entrance to the structure was flanked by a wooden shanty, by day a tool house, after working hours a shelter for the night watchman. This boasted one glazed window, dull with orange light. Approaching with due precaution, Lanyard peered in. The light came from a single electric bulb and a pot-bellied sheet-iron stove glowing red. Nearby, in a chair tipped against the wall, sat the watchman, corncob pipe in hand, head drooping, eyes closed, mouth ajar. A snore of the first magnitude seemed to vibrate the very walls. On the floor beside the chair stood a 2-quart tin pail full of arid emptiness. Dismissing further consideration of the watchman as a factor, satisfied that the entire neighbourhood as well was sound asleep, Lanyard darted up the plank wall that led into the building, and then paused to get his bearings. Effluvia of mortar and damp lumber saluted him in an uncanny place whose darkness was slightly qualified by a faint refracted glow from the low canopy of cloud and by equally dim shafts of diffused street light. There was more or less flooring of a temporary character over a sable gulf of cellars, and overhead a sullen, weeping sky cross-hatched with stark black ironwork. With infinite patience Lanyard groped his way through that dark labyrinth to the foot of a ladder ascending an open shaft wherein a hoisting tackle dangled. Here he stumbled over what he had been seeking, a great coil of 1-inch hempen cable, from which he measured off roughly what he would require if his calculations were correct, and something over. This length he recoiled and slung over his shoulder, an awkward, weighty handicap. Nevertheless, he began to climb. Above the third level was merely steel framework. He had somewhat more light to guide him, with a view of the north wall of the 79th Street house bright in the glare of avenue lamps. The wall was absolutely blank. At the 7th level the ladders ended. He stepped off upon a foot-wide beam, paused to make sure of his poise, and began to walk the girders with a sureness of foot any aviator might have envied. At regular intervals he encountered uprights. Between these he had to depend upon his sense of direction and equilibrium to guide him safely across those narrow walks of steel made slippery by rain. But, thanks to forethought, his footwork was faultless. He wore shoes old, well broken, very soft, flexible and silent. The building was in the shape of a squat E, with 2 courts facing south. On this 7th level the first court was bridged by a single girder, the middle of which was Lanyard's immediate objective. Since it lacked uprights, he took it cautiously on hands and knees until approximately equidistant from both ends, when he straddled it, took the cable from his shoulders, uncoiled the length and made it fast around the girder with a clove hitch. Giddy work in that darkness, on that greasy span, fashioning by simple sense of touch the knot upon which his life was to depend. Half of the time prone upon the girder and fishing blindly beneath it for the rope's end, with nothing but a 70-foot drop between him and eternity, not even another girder to break a fall. He was now immediately opposite the minaret, at an elevation of about 20 feet above the roof he wished to reach, and as far away, or perhaps a trifle further. Still he detected no signs of life about that nest of spies. If the wireless were in operation, its apparatus was well housed. There was no sound of the spark, never a glimmer of its violet flash. Laboriously, the knot completed to his satisfaction, Lanyard returned via the eastern arm of the E, paying out the coiled cable as he progressed, working round to the north side of the court. Once again, pausing opposite the minaret, he knotted the end of the cable loosely round an upright connecting with the 6th level, let it slide down, followed it, repeated the process, and rested finally on the 5th. Now his ordeal approached a climax which he contemplated with what calmness he could, while securing the rope beneath the arms. In another 60 seconds or less it must be demonstrated whether his dead reckoning would set him down safe and sound on the roof, or dash him against the walls of the 79th Street house, to swing back and dangle impotently in mid-air till daylight and police discovered him, unless, escaping injury, he were able to pull himself up hand over hand to the girder. With one arm round the upright to prevent the sag of rope from dragging him over prematurely, he essayed a final survey. Either the murk deceived, or Lanyard had judged shrewdly. His feet were on an approximate level with the coping around the roof, and he stood about as far from the upper girder to which the rope was hitched as that was distant from the coping. One look up and round at those lowering skies, duskily flushed by subdued city lights, With no more ceremony, Lanyard released the upright and committed his body to space. If the downward swing was breathless, what followed was breathtaking. Once past the nadir of that giant swing, he was borne upward by an impetus steadily and sensibly slackening. Instant followed leaden-winged instant, while the wall, looming like a mountainside, seemed to be toppling, insensately bent upon his annihilation. Even so, his momentum, decreasing with frightful swiftness, seemed possessed of demoniac desire to frustrate him. After an age-long agony of doubt, it became evident he was not destined to crash into the wall, but not that he was to gain the coping. Through fractions of a second, hideously protracted, this last drew near, nearer, slowly, ever more slowly, and he was twisting dizzily. With frantic effort he crooked an arm over the coping at a juncture when, had he not acted instantly, he must have swung back. There was a racking wrench, as though his arm were being torn from his socket. At the end of a struggle even more wearing, he flung his other arm across the ledge and for some time hung there, at the end of an almost taut rope, unable to overcome its resistance, and pulled himself in over the coping, stubbornly refusing to loose his grasp. Presently, grown desperate, he let go with his right hand, holding fast only with the left, fumbled in a pocket, found his knife, opened it with his teeth, and began to saw at the rope round his chest. Strand after strand parted grudgingly, till it fell away altogether, and reaction from its tension threw him against the coping with such violence that he all but lost his hold. Dropping the knife, he swept his right arm up and once more hooked his fingers over the inside of the ledge. Far down, the knife clinked suggestively upon stone. Breathing deep, Lanyard braced knees and feet against the wall, worried, heaved, hauled, squirmed like a mad thing, in the end rolled over the top and fell at length upon the roof, panting, trembling, bathed in sweat, temporarily tormented by impulses to retch. By degrees, regaining physical control, he sat up, took his bearings, and crept toward the foot of the minaret. A small narrow doorway in its base was on the latch. He passed through to the landing of a dark winding stairway with a dim light at the bottom of its circular well. While he stood attentive, intermittent stridor troubled the stillness. Originating at some point on the floors below, the prescribed wireless was at work. Hearing no other sounds, Lanyard went on down the steps, at their foot pausing to spy out through a half-open doorway to the topmost story. Nobody moved in the corridor. He saw nothing but a line of closed doors, presumably to servants' quarters. Now, however, the vibrant rasp of the radio spark was perceptibly stronger, and had a background of subdued noise, echoes of distant voices, deadened sounds of hasty footfalls, now and again a heavy thump or the bang of a door. Moving out, he commanded the length of the corridor. Toward one end a door stood open. He could see no more of the room beyond than a narrow patch of wall fitfully illuminated by a play of violet light. Then a man stepped out of this operating room, turning on the threshold to utter some parting observation, and Lanyard retired hastily to the shaft of the minaret stairway, but not before recognizing Velasco. A moment later the Brazilian passed his lurking place, walking with bended head, a worried frown darkening his swarthy countenance, and Lanyard emerged in time to see his head and shoulders vanish down a stairway at the far end of the corridor. Following with discretion, Lanyard leaned over the head of the main staircase well, looking down the 3 flights to the ground floor to which Velasco was descending. The house seemed veritably to hum with secret and, to judge by the pitch of its rumour, well nigh panic activity. One divined a scurrying as of rats about to desert a sinking ship. Untoward events had thrown this establishment into a state of excited confusion. Their nature Lanyard could not surmise, but their conjunction with his designs was exasperatingly inopportune. To search this place and find his man, if he were there at all, without being discovered, while its inmates buzzed about like so many startled hornets, was a fair impossibility. To attempt it was to court death. None the less, he was inflexible in determination to go on, to push his luck to its extremity, by sheer force to bend fortuity to his service, and suffer without complaint whatever the consequences of its recoil. Yet, even as he advanced a foot to begin the descent, he withdrew it. On the ground floor, a door closing with a resounding crash had proved the signal for an outburst of expostulate, acrimonious voices, some half a dozen men giving angry tongue at one and the same time, their roars of polysyllabic gutturalisms fusing into utterly unintelligible clamour. One thought of a mutiny in a German madhouse. Moment after moment passed, the squall persisting with unmitigated viciousness. If now and again it subsided momentarily, it was only into uglier growls and swiftly to rise once more to high frenzy of incoherence. Two of the disputants appeared in the square frame of the staircase well, oddly foreshortened figures brandishing wild arms, one of them Velasco, the other a man whom Lanyard failed to identify, seemingly united in common anger directed at the head of some person invisible. Abruptly, with a gesture of almost homicidal fury, the Brazilian darted out of sight. The other followed. Then the object of their wrath took to the stairs, stopping at the rail of the first landing and gesticulating savagely over the heads of his audience, Velasco and the others returning amid a knot of fellows to bay round the newel post. His voice, full-throated, cried them all down. Ekstrom's deep and resonant voice, domineering over the uproar, hectoring one after another into sullen silence. In the beginning, employing nothing but terms and phrases of insolence and objurgation untranslatable, when he had secured a measure of attention, he delivered a short address in tones of unqualified contempt. "I will have obedience," he stormed. "Let no one misunderstand my status here. I am come direct from His Majesty the Emperor, with full power and authority to command and direct affairs which you have, individually, collectively, proved yourselves either unfit or unable to cope with. What I do in my absolute discretion, with the full sanction and confidence of the Kaiser. He who questions my judgment or my actions questions the wisdom of the All Highest. Let it be clearly understood I am answerable to no one under God but myself and my imperial master. Henceforth be good enough to hold your tongues or take the consequences, and be damned to you all." Briefly he stood glowering down at their upturned faces, and then sneered and turned away. "Come along, O'Reilly," he said. "Fetch the woman, and give no more heed to swine dogs." His hands slipped up the rail to the first floor, vanished. If O'Reilly followed with the woman mentioned, both kept back from the rail and so out of Lanyard's field of vision. The group at the foot of the stairs moved away, grumbling profanely. At once Lanyard began to descend rapidly and without care to avoid detection. One flight down he met face to face a manservant, evidently a footman, with an armful of clothing which he was conveying from one chamber to another. The fellow stopped short, jaw dropping, eyes popping, whereupon Lanyard paused and addressed him in German with a manner of overbearing contempt, that is to say, in character. "You're wanted upstairs in the radio room," he said, "at once." The servant bleated one word of protest. "But—" "Be silent. Do as I bid you. It is an emergency. Drop those things and go. Do you hear, imbecile?" Completely cowed and cheated, the man obeyed literally, letting his burden of garments fall to the floor and bounding hurriedly up the stairs. Another flight was negotiated without misadventure. On this floor as well, servants were flitting busily to and fro, but none favoured the adventurer with the least attention. Midway down the third flight, he pulled up to one side of the landing and reconnoitred. It was on the next floor below, the first above the street, that Ekstrom had stopped. But in what quarter thereof? The exigency forbade the risk of one false turn. If Lanyard were to take Ekstrom unawares, it must be at the first cast. From the ground floor came semi-coherent snatches of surly comment, like growls of a thunderstorm passing off into the distance. "At a time such as this," "Secret Service snapping at our heels," "Base on the Vineyard discovered," "Au Printemps raided," "Sophie Weringrode under arrest, God knows whether she will hold her tongue," "Trust her, but this ass bringing a woman here, putting all our necks into a halter." Immediately opposite the foot of the stairway, on the first story, a door opened. O'Reilly came alertly forth, closed the door behind him, paused, fished in his pocket for a cigarette case, lighted and inhaled with deep appreciation. Meantime, eavesdropping on the utterances below with his head cocked to one side and a malicious smile shadowing his handsome Irish face. In his own good time he shrugged an indifferent shoulder, thrust his hands into his pockets, and sauntered coolly on down the stairs. The moment he disappeared, Lanyard went into action. In 2 bounds cleared the landing and stairs, in another threw himself upon the door. It opened readily. Entering, he put his back to it, with his left hand groped for, found and turned a key, his right holding ready the automatic pistol he had taken from the lockers of the U-boat. The room was a combination of administrative bureau and study, very handsomely if somewhat over-decorated and furnished, with an atmosphere as distinctively German as that of a Bierstube, the sombreness of its colour scheme lending weight to its array of massive desks, tables, chairs, bookcases and lounges. Between great draped windows and an impressive chimney-piece opposite, beside a broad, long desk in a straight-backed chair, sat a woman, gagged, bound as to her wrists, strips of cloth which had but lately bound ankles as well, on the floor about her feet. That woman was Cecelia Brooke. Ekstrom stood behind her, in the act of loosening the knots which held the gag secure. For a space of 30 seconds, transfixed by the apparition of his enemy, he didn't stir other than to raise weaponless hands in deference to the pistol trained upon his head. But the blood ebbed from his face, leaving it a ghastly mask in which shone the eyes of a man who sees certain death closing in upon him and is powerless to combat it, even to die fighting for life. And his lips curled back in a snarl, neither of contempt nor of hatred, but of terror. And for as long Lanyard remained as motionless, rooted in a despondency of thwarted hopes no less profound than the despair of the Prussian, apprehending what that one could not yet guess, that once more, and now certainly for the last time, vengeance was denied him, the fulfilment of all his labours and their sole purpose snatched from his grasp. The instincts of a killer were not his. Barring injudicious attempt to summon aid or take the offensive, Ekstrom was safe from injury at the hands of Michael Lanyard. His cunning, his favour in the countenance of fortune, or whatever it was that had enabled him to make the girl his prisoner and bring her here, bade fair to prove his salvation. Deep in Lanyard's consciousness an echo stirred of half-forgotten words. "Vengeance is mine." The sense of frustration brewed a hopelessness as stark as that of a browbeaten child. A blackness seemed to be settling down upon his faculties. A mist wavered momentarily before his eyes. He gulped convulsively, swallowing what had almost been a sob. But he spoke in a voice positively dispassionate. "Keep your hands up." Lanyard removed and pocketed the key, crossed to the middle of the room without once letting his gaze waver from the face of the Prussian, passed behind him, planted the muzzle of the pistol beneath Ekstrom's shoulder blade, and methodically searched him, finding and putting aside on the desk one automatic, nothing else. "Stand aside." The almost puerile measure of his disappointment was betrayed in the thrust with which he shouldered Ekstrom out of the way, so forcibly that the man was sent staggering wildly half a dozen paces. "Don't move, assassin." "Pardon, mademoiselle, one moment," Lanyard muttered, with his one free hand undoing the gag. He made slow work of that, fumbling while watching Ekstrom with unremitting intentness, hoping against hope that his enemy might make one false move, one only, by some infatuate endeavour to turn the tables, excuse his killing. But Ekstrom would not. Recovery of his equilibrium had been coincident with the shock administered to his hardihood and sense of security by Lanyard's entrance. He stood now in a pose of insouciant grace, hands idly clasped before him, disdain glimmering in languid-lidded eyes, contempt in the set of his lips, an ensemble eloquent of brazen effrontery, the outgrowth of perception of the fact that Lanyard, being what he was, could neither shoot him down in cold blood, nor, with the Brooke girl present, even attempt to injure him. Compunctions unassembled in the make-up of the Boche, therefore, when discovered in men of other races, at once despicable and ridiculous. The gag came away. "Mademoiselle has not been injured?" Lanyard inquired, solicitous. The girl coughed and gasped. shaking her head, enunciating with difficulty in little better than a husky whisper. "Roughly handled, nothing worse." Lanyard's face burned as if his blood were molten mercury. Nothing worse! Appreciation of what handling she must have suffered if she had resisted at all before those beasts could have bound her, excited an indignation from whose light, as it blazed in Lanyard's eyes, even Ekstrom winced. The hand was tremulous with which he sought to loose her wrists, so much so that she could not but notice. "Don't mind me, look to that man," she begged. "Leave me to unfasten these with my teeth. He can't be trusted for a single instant." "Mademoiselle," Lanyard mumbled, instinctively employing the French idiom, "you have reason." For an instant only he hesitated, swayed this way and that by the maddest of impulses, then resigned himself absolutely to their ascendancy. "This goes beyond all bounds," he said in an undertone. Deliberately leaving the Englishwoman to free herself according to her suggestion, forgetful indeed for the moment that she was not altogether free, he moved to the desk and left his own automatic there beside Ekstrom's. "Mademoiselle," he said mechanically, without looking at the girl, without power to perceive aught else in the world but the white, evil face of his enemy, "for what I am about to do, I beg you forgive me of your charity. I can endure no more. It is too much." He strode past her. She twisted in her chair and then rose, following him with wide eyes of alarm above her hands, whose bonds her teeth worried without rest. Ekstrom had not stirred, though one flash of pure exultation had transfigured his countenance on comprehension of Lanyard's purpose. Thanks to the silly scruples of this animal, one more chance for life was granted him. Nor would the Prussian give an inch when Lanyard paused, confronting him squarely within arm's length. "Ekstrom," the adventurer began in a voice lacking perceptible inflection, "what is between you and me needs no recounting. You know it too well, I likewise. It is my wish and my intention to kill you with my two hands. Nothing can prevent that, not even what you count upon, my reluctance, to you incomprehensible, to commit an act of violence in the presence of a woman. But because Miss Brooke is here, because you have brought her here by force, because you are what you are and so have treated her insolently, before we come to our final accounting, you shall get down upon your knees and ask her pardon." He saw no yielding in the eyes of the Prussian, only arrogance, and when he paused he was answered in one phrase of the gutters of Berlin, couched in the imagery of its lowest boozing kens, so unspeakably vile in essence and application that Lanyard heard it with an incredulity almost stupefying, almost, not altogether. It was barely spoken when those lips that framed it were crushed by a blow of such lightning delivery that, though he must have been prepared for it, Ekstrom's guard was still lowered as he reeled back, lost footing, and went to his knees. Panting, snarling, uttering teeth and blasphemy, the Prussian recoiled like a serpent, gathered himself together and launched headlong at Lanyard, only to be met full tilt by a second blow and a third, each more merciless than its predecessor, beating him down once more. This time Lanyard did not wait for him to come back for punishment, but closed in, catching him as he strove to rise, meeting each fresh effort with ruthless accuracy, battering him into insanity of despair, so that Ekstrom came back again and again without thought, animated only by frenzied brute instinct, to find the throat of his tormentor and ever failing, till at length he crumpled and lay crushed and writhing, and then subsided into insensibility, was quite still but for heaving lungs and the spasmodic clutchings of his broken and ensanguined fingers. With a start, a broken sigh, a slight movement of the hand interpreting a crushing sense of the futility of human passion, Lanyard relaxed, drew back from standing over his antagonist, abstractedly found a handkerchief and dried his hands, of a sudden so inexpressibly shamed and degraded in his own sight that he dared not look the girl's way, but stood with hang-dog air, avoiding her regard. Yet, could he have mustered up heart, he might have surprised in her eyes a light to lift him out from this slough of humiliation, to obliterate chagrin in a flood of wonder and misgivings. When, however, he did after a moment turn to her, that look was gone, replaced by one that reflected something of his own apprehension, for a heavy hand was hammering on the study door, and more than one voice on the other side was calling on Karl, to open. Either the servant whom Lanyard had met and victimized on his way downstairs had given the alarm, or else the noise of the encounter within the study had brought that pack of spies to the door, wildly demanding admission. Steadied by one swift exchange of alarmed glances with the girl, Lanyard hastily reviewed the room, seeking some avenue of escape. None offered but the windows. He ran to them, tore back their draperies, and found them closed with shutters of steel and padlocked. Simultaneously the din at the door redoubled. With a worried shake, Lanyard crossed to the chimney-piece, ducked his head and stepped into its huge fireplace. One upward glance sufficed to dash his hopes. Here was no way out. Arduous though feasible, immediately above the fireplace the flue narrowed so that not even the most active man of normal stature might hope to negotiate its ascent. He returned with only a gesture of disconcertion to answer the girl's look of appeal. "Can we do nothing?" she asked, raising her voice a trifle to make it heard above the tumult in the corridor. "There's no help for it, I'm afraid," he said, going to the desk and taking out the pistols. "Nothing to do but shoot our way out if we can. Take this," he added, offering her one of the weapons, which she accepted without spirit. "If you can't get your own consent to use it, give it to me when I've emptied the other." She breathed a dismayed "yes," and wonderingly consulted his face, since he did not stir other than thoughtfully to replace his pistol on the desk, and then stood staring at his soot-smeared palms. "What is it?" she demanded nervously. "Why do you hesitate?" As one fretted by inconsequential questions, he merely shook his head, glanced sidelong at the unconscious Prussian, again with calculation toward the door. This he saw quivering under repeated blows. With brusque decision he said: "Get a chair. Brace it beneath the doorknob, please," and leaving her without more explanation, turned back to the fireplace. Motionless, in dumb confusion, the girl stood staring after him till, roused by a blow of such splintering force as to suggest that an axe had been brought into play upon the door, then ran to a ponderous club chair and with considerable exertion managed to trundle it to the door and tip it over, wedging its back beneath the knob. By this time it had become indisputably patent that an axe was battering the panels, but the door, in character of the room, was a substantial piece of workmanship and needed more than a few blows, even of an axe, to break down its barrier of solid oak. She looked round to discover Lanyard kneeling beside Ekstrom, insanely, so it seemed to the girl, engaged in blackening the upper half of the man's face with a handful of soot. Unconsciously uttering a little cry of distress, she sped to his side and caught his shoulder with an importunate hand. "In Heaven's name, Monsieur Duchemin, what are you doing? Is this a time for childishness?" He responded with a smile of boyish mischief so genuine that her doubts of his reason seemed all too well confirmed. "Making up my understudy," he said simply, and brushing his hands over the rug to rid them of superfluous soot, Lanyard rose. "Please go back and stand by the door, on the side of the hinges. I'll be with you in 1 minute." Resigned to humour this lunatic whim, what else could she do? The girl retreated to the position designated, and watched with ever darker doubts of his sanity, while Lanyard hurriedly drew the shells from his automatic and carefully placed its butt in the slack grasp of Ekstrom's fingers. And then, lifting from a nearby table a great cut-glass bowl of flowers, the adventurer inverted it over Ekstrom's body. Expending its full force upon the man's chest, that miniature deluge splashed widely, wetting his face, half filling his open mouth. Some of the soot was washed away, but not a great deal. Enough stuck fast to suit Lanyard's purpose. Roused by that cool shock, half strangled as well, Ekstrom coughed violently, squirmed, spat out a mouthful of water, lifted on an elbow, still more than half dazed. Joining the girl by the door, Lanyard saw the Prussian sit up and glare blankly round the room, a figure of tragic fun. Drenched, woefully disfigured, eyes rolling wildly in the wide spaces round them which Lanyard had left unblackened. Swinging the club chair away from the door, the adventurer placed it with its back to the room. "Get down behind that," he indicated shortly, and drew the key from his pocket. "Don't show yourself for your life, and let me have that pistol, please." A bright triangular wedge of steel broke through one of the panels as he fitted and turned the key in the lock. His wits clearing, Ekstrom saw him, and with a howl of fury staggered to his feet, clutching the unloaded pistol and endeavouring to level it for steady aim. Simultaneously Lanyard turned the knob and let the door fly open, remaining beside the chair that hid the girl. A knot of spies, O'Reilly and Velasco among them, whirled into the room, pulled up at sight of that strange, grim figure, disguised beyond all recognition by its half mask of black facing, and menacing them with a pistol. O'Reilly fired in the next breath, his shot echoed by half a dozen so closely bunched as to resemble the rattle of a mitrailleuse. At the first report the pistol dropped from Ekstrom's grasp. He carried a hand vaguely to his throat, staggered a single step, uttered a strange moan, and fell forward, his body fairly riddled, his death little short of instantaneous. While the fusillade was still resounding, Lanyard, seizing the girl's wrist, unceremoniously dragged her from behind the chair and thrust her through the door, retreating after her with his face to the roomful, his pistol ready. None of that lot paid him any heed, the attention of all wholly absorbed by the tragedy their violent hands had wrought. Velasco, the first to stir, ran forward and dropped to his knees beside the dead man. Others followed. Gently Lanyard drew the door to, locked it on the outside, and at the sound of a choking cry from Cecelia Brooke, whirled smartly round, prepared if need be to make good his promise to clear with gunplay a way to the street, though opposed by every inmate of the establishment. But the first face he saw was Crane's. The Secret Service man stood within a yard. To him, as to a rock of refuge, Cecelia Brooke had flown. To his hands she was clinging like a frightened child, trying to speak, failing because she choked on sobs and gasps of horror. Behind him, on the landing at the head of the staircase, running up from below, ascending to the upper storeys, were a score or more of men of sturdy and businesslike bearing and indubitably American stamp. Of these two were herding into a corner a little group of frightened German servants. Lanyard's stare of astonishment was met by Crane's twisted smile. "My friend," he said, as quietly as anyone could with his accent of a quizzical buzzsaw, "I sure got to hand it to you. Every time I try to pull anything off on the dead quiet, you beat me to it clean. Everywhere I think you ain't and can't be, that's just where you are. But I ain't complaining. I got to admit, if you hadn't staged your act to occupy the minds of those gents in there, we might have had a lot more difficulty raiding this joint." Quickly he wound an arm round the waist of Cecelia Brooke, when, without warning, she swayed blindly and would have fallen. "Here now," he protested, "that's no way to do. Why, she's flickered out. Well, Monsieur Dumarchin Lanyard Ember, to a man up a tree this looks like your job. You take this little lady off my hands and see her home, and I'll just naturally try and finish what I started, or what you did. For, son, I got to give you credit. You sure are one grand little trouble hound." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The False Faces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Mattingly. The False Faces by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 21. Question. Through the breathing hush of that dark hour which foreruns the dawn, that hour in which the head that knows a wakeful pillow is prone to sudden and disquieting apprehension of its insignificance and its soul's dread isolation, the cab sped swiftly south upon the avenue, shadowed reaches of the park upon its right. Upon its left the dull, tired faces of those homes whose tenants lay wrapped in the cotton wool of riches. The rain had ceased. A little wind was blowing up. There was a fresh smell in the air. Sidewalks began to be maculated with spreading areas of dryness, but the roadway was still wet and shining, the wide black mirror of a myriad lights. Through the windows of the speeding cab an orderly procession of street lamps, marching past, threw each its fugitive and pallid glimmer. Periods of modified darkness intervened, when the face of the girl in her corner seemed a vision subtle and wraith-like. But ever the recurrent lights revealed her sweetly incarnate, if deep in enervation, of crushing weariness. But ever the recurrent lights revealed her sweetly incarnate, if deep in enervation of crushing weariness. Once she stirred and sighed profoundly, and Lanyard, bending toward her, asked if he could be in any way of service. She replied in an undertone scarcely better than a whisper: "Thank you, I am quite comfortable. Please, what time is it?" The cab was passing 60th Street. Lanyard caught a fleeting glimpse of a street clock with a dial like a little golden moon. "It's just 4." "Thank you." "Very tired?" "Very." He had the maddest notion that her head inclined to droop towards his shoulder. Perhaps the motion of the cab.... If so, she recovered easily. "Can I do anything?" "No, thank you, only—" An ungloved hand stirred from her lap, for the merest instant rested lightly above his own, or hovered rather, barely touching it with a touch tenuous and elusive, no sooner realized than gone. "I mean," she murmured, "I am a bit too overwrought, too tired to talk." "I quite understand," he said. "Please forget I'm here. Just rest." Perhaps she smiled drowsily, or was that too a freak of his imagination? Lanyard assured himself it was. In excess of consideration, even tried to persuade himself he had dreamed that ghost of a caress upon his hand. It seemed so little like her. Not that anything had happened more than a gesture of transient inadvertence due to fatigue. It could not have been intentional, that act of intimacy, when the girl was altogether engrossed in young Thackeray. There was something one must not forget, something that gave the lie flatly to that innuendo of the Weringrode's. Ignorant of the circumstances, the intriganta had leaped blindly at conclusions, after the habit of her kind. True, Sophie had not implied that this girl cared for him, but vice versa. Either supposition, however, was absurd as the other. As if Lanyard could love a woman who loved another! As if the name of love meant aught to him but the memory of a sweetness like a vagrant air of spring that had breathed fitfully for a season upon the winter of his heart. A corner of Lanyard's mouth lifted in a sneer. That precious heart of his, the heart of a thief, upon which even now the fruits of his thieving weighed. Irritated, he wrenched his thoughts into another channel and began to piece together inconsecutive snatches of information gained from Crane in the confusion of the quarter hour just past, while the Secret Service operatives were busy rounding up the inmates of that spy fold and searching for evidences of their impudent activities. It appeared that Washington had at length, however tardily, roused out of its inertia, and at midnight had telegraphed instructions to arrest out of hand every enemy alien in the land against whom there was evidence of conspiracy or even a ponderable suspicion. So unexpected was this order that Crane had volunteered to show Cecelia Brooke that midnight rendezvous of the Prussian spy system, without the least notion that he might be required before morning to lead a raiding force against the establishment; and even when a messenger stopped him as he turned to enter Au Printemps, he was not advised concerning the cause of this demand for his immediate presence at headquarters. The first cast of what Crane aptly termed the dragnet had brought in the management and service staff to a man, with a number of the restaurant's habitués, including Sophie Weringrode and her errand boy, the exquisite Mr. Revell. Velasco, however, had somehow mysteriously managed to slip through the meshes and had straightway hastened to spread the alarm. As for O'Reilly and Dressier, they had left with Ekstrom in pursuit of Lanyard less than 5 minutes before, and so had escaped not only arrest but all knowledge of the raid prior to their return to 79th Street. The second cast of the net had been made at the latter place as soon as the watchers were able to assure Crane that Ekstrom and O'Reilly had returned, Dressier having anticipated them there by something like half an hour. By daybreak, then, these gentry would be interned on Ellis Island. And break of day impended visibly in greyish shades that stole westward through the crosstown streets like clouds of secret agents spying out the city against invasion by the serried lances of the sun. A garish twilight washed 42nd Street from wall to wall by the time the car swung round in front of the Knickerbocker. As yet, however, there was little evidence that the town was growing restive in its sleep with premonition of the ardour of another day. Lanyard stepped down and offered the girl a hand in whose palm her slender fingers rested lightly for an instant, ere she passed on, while he turned to bid the driver wait. Following, he overtook her in the entrance, where by tacit consent both paused and lingered in an odd constraint. There was so much to be said that it was impossible to say just then. Visibly the woman drooped, betraying physical exhaustion in every line of her pose, seeming scarcely strong enough to lift the silken lashes that trembled upon cheeks a little drawn and pale, with the faintest of bluish rings beneath the eyes. "I must not keep you," Lanyard broke the silence. "I merely wish to say good night, and I am sorry." "Sorry?" she echoed. "That you had such an unhappy experience," he explained. "Thanks to your thoughtfulness for me, I do not deserve so much consideration, and that only makes me feel all the more regretful." "It was silly of me," she admitted with a shadowy, rueful smile. "I'm afraid my silliness makes too much trouble." He commented honestly: "I don't understand." "If I had only been patient enough to wait for you to call me." "Forgive that oversight. I was pressed for time, as you may imagine." "Oh, it all comes back to my own stupidity. I might have known you had come through all right." "How should you?" "Why not? When you turn up here in New York, safe and sound after being drowned on the Assyrian, as if that were not proof enough that you bear a charmed life." "Charmed?" he laughed. "And you haven't yet told me how you survived that adventure." "You are kind to be interested, and I am unfortunate in never seeing you save under circumstances unfavourable for yarn spinning. You might be more fortunate." "Only tell me how." "If you cared to ask me to dine with you to morrow, I mean to night." "You would?" He was distressed by consciousness that his voice had thrilled impetuously, but perhaps she had not noticed. There was no change in the even friendliness of her tone. "I'm as inquisitive as any woman that ever lived. Even if I wished to, I'm afraid I shouldn't be able to resist an invitation to hear your Odyssey." "Delmonico's at 8?" "Thank you," she said primly. "You make me too happy. May I call for you?" "Please." She offered a hand whose touch he found cool, steady and impersonal. "Good morning, Mr. Ember." He stood in a stare while she went quickly through the lobby to a waiting elevator, then roused and went back to his cab. It was by daylight that he re-entered his rooms and found them tenanted by a negro boy, bound and gagged, bruised and sore, and scared beyond intelligible expression. Freeing him and salving his injuries bodily and spiritual with a liberal douceur, Lanyard exacted an oath of silence, and then turned him out. He had approximately 5 hours to put in somehow before his appointment with Colonel Stanistreet at 9, and was too well versed in the law of late hours to think of giving any part of that time to sleep. By so doing he would only ensure a mutinous awakening with mind and body sluggish and unrested. If, on the other hand, he remained awake, he would go to that interview in a state of supernormal animation exceedingly to be desired if he were to round out this adventure without discredit. For its end was not yet. He had still a part to play whose lines were not yet written, whose business remained to be invented. He neither dared shirk that appointment for reasons of policy, nor wished to, while there remained reparation to be accomplished, a wrong to be righted, justice to be done, a question to be answered. Only when these matters had been put in order would he feel his honour discharged of its burdens, himself free once more to drop out and go in peace his lonely ways in life, ways henceforth to be both lonely and aimless. For, when he strove to peer into the future, only an emptiness confronted him. With Ekstrom accounted for finally and forevermore, there was nothing to come but the final accounting of the Lone Wolf with that civilization which had bred and suffered him. One way presented itself to make that reckoning even. The Foreign Legion of France asks no embarrassing questions of its recruits, and enlistment in its ranks offers with anonymity a consoling certainty. Thus alone might he find his way home to the heart of that enigma whence he had emerged, a nameless waif, astray in grim Parisian byways. This vision of his end contenting him, he began to scheme a campaign for the day that was simple enough in prospect: a little chicanery with Stanistreet, a personal appeal to Crane to restore the passports of Monsieur André Duchemin, which must have been found on Ekstrom's body, a berth on some steamer sailing for Europe, and then the last evanishment. One detail alone troubled him: his promise to the Brooke girl that she should dine with him that night. Reminded of this obligation, figuratively, he seized Michael Lanyard by the scruff of his neck and shook him with a savage hand. What insensate folly was ever his, what want of wit and strength to keep out of temptation's way! Why must he have fallen in so readily with her suggestion? Why this infatuate thirst for sympathy, this eagerness to violate the seals of reticence at the wish of a strange woman? Was there any reasonable explanation of the strange lack of his wonted self-sufficiency in the company of Cecelia Brooke? No matter. If he might not contrive somehow to squirm out of that engagement, he could at all events school himself to decent reticence. He promised himself to make his account of the submarine adventure drearily bald and trite, to minimize to the last degree his part therein, above all things to refrain from painting the lone wolf in romantic colours. She was much too good a sort, too straight, sincere, fair-minded, honest, the sort of girl who deserved the Thackeray sort of man, never a thief. If she even dreamed... Lanyard brought forth from its hiding-place the necklace, weighed it in his hand, examined it minutely. Granting its marvellous perfection, he recognized no more its beauty, dispassionately reviewed in turn each stone of matchless loveliness, no more susceptible to their seductive purity, perceiving in them nothing but hard, bright, translucent pebbles, cold, soulless, cruel. One by one they slipped through his fingers like beads of an unholy rosary. At length, crushing them together in the hollow of his palm, he stood awhile in thought, then turning to his writing desk, bundled the necklace in wrappings of white tissue secured with rubber bands, counted carefully the sheaf of bills he had taken from Ekstrom, sealed the whole amount in a plain long envelope, and put this aside in company with the necklace. Already 2 hours had passed, and since he meant to call at the house on West End Avenue well in advance of the hour when Cecelia Brooke might be there, presuming Blensop had given her the same appointment as he had given Mr. Ember, that is, 9 o'clock, it was now time to prepare. Returning to his bedchamber, he laid out a carefully selected change of clothing, shaved, parboiled himself in a hot bath, chilled him to the pith in one of icy coldness, and dressed with scrupulous heed to detail, studiously effacing every sign of his sleepless night. That experience was in no way to be surmised from his appearance when he sallied forth to breakfast at the Plaza. At 8 precisely, presenting himself at the Stanistreet residence, he desired the footman to announce him as the author of a certain telegram from Edgartown. He was obliged to wait less than a minute. The footman returned in haste to request him to step into the library. This apartment, which he found much as he had last seen it 8 hours ago, its window shattered, the portieres down, the furniture in some disorder, was, on his introduction, occupied by 2 persons: one, an elderly, iron-grey gentleman of untidy dress and unobtrusive habit in spite of a discerning, cool grey eye; the other, Mr. Blensop, in the neatest of one-button morning coat effects with striped trouserings, neither too smart nor too sober for that state of life unto which it had pleased God to call him, and fair white spats. If his attire was radiant, so was the temper of the secretary sunny. He tripped forward in sprightliest fashion, offering cordial hands to the caller till he recognized him, and even then was discountenanced only for the briefest moment. "My dear Mr. Ember," he purred soothingly, "why didn't you tell me last night it was you who had sent that telegram? If I had for a moment suspected the truth, you should have had your appointment with Colonel Stanistreet at any hour you might have cared to name, no matter how ungodly." Lanyard bowed gravely. "Thank you," he said. "And Colonel Stanistreet?" "Is just finishing breakfast. He will be down directly. Please be seated, make yourself entirely at ease, and will you excuse me?" "With pleasure," Lanyard assured him, his gravity unbroken. A doubt clouded Mr. Blensop's bright eyes, but its transit was instantaneous. He turned forthwith to join the iron-grey man before the portrait which concealed the safe. "And now, Mr. Stone," said Mr. Blensop with indulgence. "Well, sir," said Mr. Stone quietly, "if you'll be good enough to show me how this contraption works, maybe I'll find out something interesting, maybe not." Mr. Blensop proceeded to oblige by operating the lever and sliding aside the portrait. "Thanks," said Mr. Stone, producing a magnifying glass from a waistcoat pocket and beginning to peer myopically at the face of the safe. "I take it nobody's been pawing over this since the late, as you might say, unpleasantness." "Not a soul has touched it. By Colonel Stanistreet's order it was covered as soon as we found it had been tampered with." "Hmm," Mr. Stone acknowledged, bending close to his work. Partially, perhaps by way of administering an urbane rebuke to Lanyard for his readiness to dispense with his society, Mr. Blensop remained in the neighbourhood of Mr. Stone, hovering around him like a domesticated humming bird. "Did you find anything?" he inquired when Stone straightened up. "Fingerprints aplenty," Mr. Stone admitted with a hint of temper. "A slew of the damn things. Looks like you must have called in the neighbours to help make a good show. However, we'll see what we can make of 'em." He conjured from some recess in his clothing a squat bottle, from another a stopper in which was fitted a blowpipe, joined the two together, approached the safe with one end of the pipe between his lips, and sprayed it with a thin film of white powder, the contents of the bottle. "I say, do tell me what that's for." "That," said Mr. Stone patiently, "is to make the fingerprints stand out, so we can get a good likeness of 'em." He put the bottle aside, blinked at the safe approvingly, and by further exercise of powers of legerdemain materialized a pocket kodak and a flashlight pistol. "Can't I help you?" Blensop offered eagerly. "I used to be rather a dab at amateur photography, you know." "Well, I'm kind of stuck on pressing the button myself," Stone confessed, adjusting the focus. "But if you want to work that flashlight, I don't mind." "Delighted," Mr. Blensop asserted. "How does it go now?" "Like this." Stone set his camera down to demonstrate. "Now stand just behind me," he concluded, "and pull the trigger when I say now." "I'll do my best. But, I say, will it bang?" Stone had taken up the camera once more. His sole answer was a grunt upon which his hearers placed two distinct interpretations, Lanyard's offering him considerable gratification. "If you're ready," said Stone, "now." Mr. Blensop squinted unbecomingly and pressed the trigger. A vivid flare lifted from the pan of the pistol and winked out in a cloud of vapour, slowly dissipating. "Is that all?" "Yes, sir, that's all of that." Stone stowed the camera away about his person, and from another cranny produced a small cardboard box of glass slides, one of which he offered. "Now, if you'll just run your fingers through your hair and rest them on this side, light but steady." "What for?" Blensop demanded with a giggle of nervous reluctance. "You don't think I'm the thief, do you?" "No, sir, I don't. But if I haven't got your fingerprints, how am I going to tell them from the thief's?" "Oh, I see," Blensop said with a note of allayed apprehension, and put himself on record. The door opened to admit Colonel Stanistreet. Lanyard rose. At sight of him the Englishman checked and stared inquiringly, his eyes shadowed by careworn brows, for it was apparent that, if the events of the night had not depressed the spirits of his secretary, his employer had known little sleep or none since the burglary. "Colonel Stanistreet," Blensop said, melodiously abandoning Stone to his unsupervised devices, "this is Mr. Ember, the gentleman who called last night before you got home. It appears he is the person who sent us that telegram from Edgartown day before yesterday." "Indeed? Ember is not the name with which the message was signed." "The message was purposely left unsigned," Lanyard explained. Stanistreet nodded approval. "I am glad to meet you, Mr. Ember," he said, offering a hand. "Be seated. I am most anxious first to express our gratitude, next to learn how you came by your information." "You will find it an interesting story." "No doubt of that." Stanistreet took the desk chair, opened a cigar humidor and offered it. "I shall be even more interested, however," he said with an evanescent trace of humour, "to know who the devil you are, sir." "That is something I am prepared to prove to your satisfaction." "If you will be so good. But excuse me for one moment." Stanistreet turned in his chair. "Mr. Stone?" "Yes, sir." "Have you finished with the safe? If so, I want my secretary to check over its contents carefully and make sure nothing else is missing." "I'm all through with it, Colonel Stanistreet. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to mouse around and see if I can nose out anything else that's useful." "That shall be entirely as you will. Now, Blensop," Stanistreet nodded to his secretary, "let us make certain." "Yes, sir." Blithely Mr. Blensop addressed himself to the safe. "There has been an accident of some sort, Colonel Stanistreet?" Lanyard inquired civilly, nodding towards the shattered French window. "A burglary, sir." "The criminal escaped?" Stanistreet nodded. "Our watchman surprised him and was shot for his pains. Not seriously, I'm happy to say. The burglar got himself tangled up in that window, but extricated in time and went over the garden wall before we could determine which way he had taken." "I trust you lost nothing of value?" Stanistreet shrugged. "Unhappily we did. A diamond necklace, the property of my sister in law, and a document we could ill afford to part with." "But you offered to show me credentials, I believe." "Such as they are," Lanyard replied. "My passports and letters were stolen from me, but these I think should serve as well to prove my bona fides." He laid out in order upon the desk his plunder from the safe aboard the U boat, all but the money, the 3 cipher codes, the log, the diary of the commander, the directory of German secret agents, and such other documents as he had selected. The first Colonel Stanistreet took up with a dubious frown which swiftly lightened, yielding as he pursued his examination into the papers and began to recognize their surpassing value to the Allied cause, to a subdued glimmer of gratulatory excitement. But he was at pains to satisfy himself as to the authenticities of each paper in turn, providing a lull for which Lanyard was not ungrateful, since it gave him a chance to adjust his understanding to an unexpected development in the affair. He lounged at ease, smoking, his eyes half veiled by lowered lids, keenly reviewing the room and its tenants. Stone, the detective, an operative Lanyard rightly inferred of the American Secret Service, loaned to the British in order to keep the burglary out of police records and newspapers, had wandered out into the garden that glowed with young April sunlight beyond the windows. From time to time he was to be seen stooping and inspecting the earth with the gravity of an earnest, efficient, sober-sided sleuth of the old school. Blensop was busy before the safe, extracting the contents of each pigeonhole in turn, thumbing its dockets of papers, checking each off upon a typewritten list several pages in length. To that lithe and debonair figure Lanyard's gaze oftenest reverted. So not only had the necklace been stolen, but a document, which the British Secret Service could ill afford to part with. Lanyard entertained no least doubt as to the identity of the document in question. There could be but one, he felt, which Stanistreet would so characterize. That document had not been in the safe when Lanyard had opened it at midnight. After a moment Mr. Blensop uttered a musical note of vexation. The lead of his pencil had broken. He threw it pettishly aside, came over to the desk, took up a penholder, dipped it in the inkwell, and returned to his task. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The False Faces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. The False Faces by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 22. Chicane. Colonel Stanistreet put down the last of the papers and slapped his hand upon it resoundingly. "This is one of the most remarkable collections of data, I venture to assert, that has ever come into the hands of the British Government. Have you any idea of its value?" Lanyard lifted a whimsical eyebrow. "Some," he admitted dryly. "And what do you ask for it, sir?" "Nothing." The gaze of the Englishman bored into his eyes, but he met their challenge with an unshaken countenance, smiling. "My dear sir," Stanistreet demanded, "who are you?" "The name under which I sailed for New York on board the Assyrian," Lanyard announced quietly, "was André Duchemin." Disturbed by a startled exclamation, together with the sound of shuffling and a slight thump, he looked round in mild curiosity to see Blensop staggered and astare, standing over a litter of documents which had slipped from his grasp to the floor. Mastering his emotion quickly enough, the secretary knelt with a mumbled apology and began to pick up the papers. With no more notice of the incident, Lanyard returned undivided attention to Colonel Stanistreet. "I had another name," he confessed, "and a reputation none too savoury, as, I dare say, you know." Through the courtesy of the British Intelligence Office I was permitted to disguise these, but on the Assyrian I was recognized, in short, ran afoul of German Secret Service agents who knew me but whom I did not know. On the sixth night out circumstances conspired to make me seem a serious obstacle to their schemes. Consequently I was waylaid, robbed and thrown overboard. Within the next few minutes a torpedo struck the ship and the submarine which fired it came up under me as I struggled to keep afloat. By passing myself off as a Boche spy, I succeeded in inducing the commander to take me below, and so reached the Martha's Vineyard base. There chance played into my hands. I contrived to seek the U-boat and escape, as reported in my telegram." During a brief silence he found opportunity to observe that Mr. Blensop was working with hands that trembled singularly. "Incredible!" Stanistreet commented. "Yet here is proof," Lanyard asserted, indicating the papers beneath Stanistreet's hand. "My dear sir, I didn't mean—" "Pardon!" Lanyard smiled, with a lifted hand. "I never thought you did, Colonel Stanistreet. But it is your duty to make sure you are not imposed upon by plausible adventurers. Therefore, since my papers have been stolen, I am glad to be able to prove my identity with André Duchemin by referring to survivors of the Assyrian disaster. Among others, Mr. Sherry, the second officer, Mr. Crane of the United States Secret Service, and a countrywoman of yours, a Miss Cecelia Brooke, whose acquaintance I was fortunate enough to make." Stanistreet nodded heavily, and consulted his watch. "Miss Brooke," he said, "should be here shortly. Blensop made an appointment with her last night, which I confirmed by telephone this morning." "Then, with permission, I shall remain and ask her to vouch for me," Lanyard suggested in resignation, since it appeared he was not to be permitted to escape this girl, that destiny was not yet finished with their entanglement. "I shall be glad if you will, sir, Monsieur Duchemin," Stanistreet began, but hesitated. "Or do you prefer another style?" "I am content with Duchemin." "That is a matter for your own discretion, but I should warn you it may already have acquired an evil odour on this side. To my knowledge it has been used within the last 24 hours, and the pretensions of its wearer supported by your stolen credentials." "I am not surprised," Lanyard stated reflectively. "A chap with a beard, perhaps?" "Why, yes." "Anderson," the adventurer nodded. "That, at least, was his alias when he jockeyed himself into the second steward's berth aboard the Assyrian." He glanced idly across the room, discovered Blensop once more at pause in a stare, and grinned amiably. "He came here last night," Stanistreet volunteered deliberately, "representing himself as André Duchemin, to sell me a certain paper, the same which subsequently, I am convinced, he returned to steal." "And did," Lanyard added. "And did," the Briton conceded. "Now you have told me who he is, I promise you every effort shall be made to apprehend him and prevent further misuse of the name you have assumed." "It has," Lanyard said tersely. "I beg your pardon?" "I say every effort has been made, and successfully, to accomplish the ends you mention." "What's that you say?" Blensop demanded shrilly, crossing to the desk. "My secretary," Stanistreet explained, "was present at the interview and is naturally interested." "And very good of him, I'm sure," Lanyard agreed. "I was about to explain, Mr. Blensop, that Ekstrom, alias Anderson, was killed in the course of a raid on the Prussian spy headquarters in 79th Street this morning." "Amazing!" Blensop gasped. "I am glad to hear it," he added, and went slowly back to his task. "I may as well tell you, sir," Lanyard pursued, "I have every reason to believe the document sold you last night was one of those stolen from me." Stanistreet wagged a contentious head. "I cannot conceive how it could have come into your possession, sir." "Simply enough. Miss Brooke requested me to take care of it for her." The eyes of the Englishman grew stony. "Miss Brooke!" he repeated testily. "I don't understand." "It was a document I do not seek to know its nature from you, sir of vital importance in this present crisis, with the United States newly entered into the war." Stanistreet affirmed with an inclination of his head. "I may tell you this much, Monsieur Duchemin. If it had not reached this country safely, what am I saying? If it be not recovered without delay, the chances of America's early and efficient participation in the war will suffer a tremendous setback. Blensop, be good enough to call up the American Secret Service at once and ask whether the document in question was found on the body of this Ekstrom." "Pardon," Lanyard interposed, as Blensop hesitantly approached the telephone. "It would be a waste of time. I happen to know, because I was there, that no such document was found on Ekstrom's body." "The devil!" Stanistreet grumbled. "What can have become of it? This business grows only the blacker the deeper one seeks to fathom it. I must own myself completely at a loss. How it came into the hands of Miss Brooke I can explain that, I think. The document was in the care of two gentlemen, Mr. Bartholomew and Lieutenant Thackeray. The former was murdered by the Huns in search of it, Lieutenant Thackeray murderously assaulted. But for Miss Brooke's intervention the assassins must have succeeded. As it was, the young woman herself found it and, one presumes, took charge of it, because her fiancé was incapacitated, and possibly with the notion that she might thereby prevent further mischief of the same nature." "Her fiancé?" Stanistreet echoed blankly. "Lieutenant Thackeray." "Her brother, sir," the Briton laughed. "Thackeray was his nom de service." It was Lanyard's turn to stare. "Ah!" he murmured. "A light begins to dawn." "Upon me as well," Stanistreet confessed. "Miss Brooke and her brother are orphans, and before the war were inseparable companions. I do not doubt that, learning he had been commissioned with an uncommonly perilous errand, she booked passage by the Assyrian without his consent in order to be near him in event of danger." "This explains much," Lanyard conceded, "much that perplexed more than one can say." "But in no way advances us on the trial of the purloined document." "I am afraid, sir," Lanyard lied deliberately, "you may as well abandon all hope of ever seeing it again. Ekstrom made away with it, no question about that. There was time enough and to spare between his exploit here and his death for him to deliver it to safe hands. It is doubtless decoded by this time, a copy of it already well on the way to the Wilhelmstrasse." "I am afraid," Stanistreet echoed "I am very much afraid you are right." His thick, spatulate fingers of an executive drummed heavily upon the desk. Stone's figure darkened the windows. "Colonel Stanistreet," he called diffidently. "Yes, Mr. Stone." "There's something here I'd like to consult you about, sir, if you can spare a minute." "Certainly." The Englishman rose. "If you will excuse me, Monsieur Duchemin." Halfway to the windows he hesitated. "By the by, Blensop, I wish you'd call up Apthorp and ask after Howson's condition." "Very good, sir," Blensop intoned cheerfully. "And do it without delay, please. I don't like to think of the poor fellow suffering." "Immediately, sir." As his employer passed out into the garden with Stone, the secretary discontinued his checking and came over to the desk, drawing up a chair and sitting down to telephone. At the same time Lanyard got up and began to pace thoughtfully to and fro. "Howson is the wounded night watchman, I take it, Mr. Blensop?" "Yes, an excellent fellow." "Schuyler 9 300," Blensop cooed into the transmitter. Conceivably that ostensible discomfiture whose symptoms Lanyard had remarked had been a transitory humour. Mr. Blensop was now in what seemed the most equable and blithe of tempers. His very posture at the telephone eloquently betokened as much. He had thrown himself into the chair with picturesque nonchalance, sitting with body half turned from the desk, his right hand holding the receiver to his ear, his left thrust carelessly into his trouser pocket, thus dragging back the lapel of that impeccable morning coat and exposing the bright cap of his gold mounted fountain pen. Something in that implement seemed to possess for Lanyard overpowering fascination. His gaze yearned for it, returned again and again to it. He changed his course to stroll up and down behind Blensop, between him and the safe. "I understood Colonel Stanistreet to say the watchman was not seriously injured, I believe," he observed with interest. "Shot through the shoulder, that is all." "Schuyler 9 300? Dr. Apthorp, please. This is Mr. Blensop speaking, secretary to Colonel Stanistreet. Are you there, Dr. Apthorp?" With professional dexterity, Lanyard en passant dropped a hand over the young man's shoulder and lightly lifted the pen from its place in the pocket of Blensop's waistcoat. The even tempo of his step unbroken, he tossed it toward the safe, where it fell without sound upon a heavy Persian rug. "Yes, about Howson," the musical accents continued. "Colonel Stanistreet is most solicitous." Swiftly Lanyard moved toward the safe, glanced through the French windows to assure himself that Stanistreet and Stone were safely preoccupied, whipped out the envelope he had prepared, and thrust it into a file of papers which did not crowd its pigeonhole, accomplishing the complete manoeuvre with such adroitness that, like the business of the pen, it passed utterly without the knowledge of the secretary. "Thank you so much. Good morning, Dr. Apthorp." Lanyard was passing the desk when Blensop rose, and the footman was entering with his salver. "A lady to see Colonel Stanistreet, sir, by appointment, she says." Blensop glanced at the card. At the same time Stanistreet came in from the garden, leaving Stone to potter about visibly in the distance. "Miss Brooke is here, sir," the secretary announced. "Ask her to come in, please." The footman retired. "Howson is resting easily, Dr. Apthorp reports," Blensop added, going back to the safe. "Has Stone turned up anything of interest, sir?" "Footprints," Stanistreet replied, with a snort of moderate impatience. "He's quite upset since I've informed him the man who made them is—" "Good God!" The interruption was Blensop's, in a voice strangely out of tune. Stanistreet wheeled sharply upon him. "What the deuce?" he snapped. By every indication the secretary had suffered the most severe shock of his experience. His face was ghastly, his eyes vacant, his knees shook beneath him. One hand pressed convulsively the bosom of his waistcoat. His endeavours to reply evoked only a husky, rattling sound. "What the devil has come over you?" Stanistreet insisted. The rattle became articulate. "I've lost it. It's gone." "What have you lost?" Nothing, sir. That is, I mean to say, my fountain pen." "The way you take it, I should say you'd lost your head," Stanistreet commented. "You must have dropped the thing somewhere. Look about. See if you can't find it." Thus admonished, the secretary began to search the floor with frantic glances, and as the footman ushered in Cecelia Brooke, Lanyard saw the young man dart forward and retrieve the pen with a start of relief well nigh as unmanning as the shock of loss had seemed. With that, Lanyard's interest in the fellow waned. He was too poor a thing to consider seriously, while here was one who compelled anew, as ever when they met, the homage of sincere and marvelling admiration. Yet another of those miracles of feminine adaptability and makeshift had brought the girl to this meeting in the guise of one who had never known a broken night or an hour's care, with a look of such fresh tranquillity that it seemed hardly possible she could be one and the same with that wilted little woman whom Lanyard had left in the gray dawn at the entrance to the Hotel Knickerbocker. A tailored suit, necessarily borrowed plumage, became her so completely that it was difficult to believe it not her own. Her eyes were calm and sweet with candor, her color was a clear and artless glow. The hand she offered the Briton was tremorless. "Colonel Stanistreet? I am he, Miss Brooke. It is kind of you to call so early to relieve my mind about your brother. I have known Lionel so long—" "He is resting easily," said the girl. "His complete recovery is merely a matter of time and nursing." "That is good news," said Stanistreet. "Monsieur Duchemin, I believe you know." "I have been fortunate in that at least." Gravely Lanyard saluted the hand extended to him in turn. "Mademoiselle is most gracious," he said humbly. "Then I understand Monsieur Duchemin must have told you—" The girl addressed Stanistreet. "Permit me to leave you," Lanyard interposed. "No," she begged "please not. I've nothing to say that you may not hear. You have been too much involved." "If mademoiselle insists," Lanyard demurred, "I feel it is not right I should stay. And yet, if you will indulge me, I should like very much to demonstrate the truth of an old saw." Two confused looks were his response. "I fear I, for one, do not follow," Stanistreet admitted. "I will explain quite briefly," Lanyard promised. "The adage I have in mind is as old as human wit. Set a thief to catch a thief. And the last time it was quoted in my hearing it was not to my advantage. I recall, indeed, resenting it enormously." He paused with purpose, looked down at the desk. A pad of blank paper caught his eye. He took it up and examined it with an abstracted manner. "Well, monsieur, the application of your adage. Colonel Stanistreet, what would you think if I were to tell you the combination of your safe?" "I should be inclined to suspect that you were the devil," Stanistreet chuckled. "By all accounts a gentleman of intelligence. One is flattered. Very well, I proceed to demonstrate black art with the aid of this white paper pad. The combination, monsieur, is as follows: 9, 27, 18, 36." A low cry of bewilderment greeted this announcement. Blensop had drawn near and was eyeing Lanyard as if under the influence of hypnotism. "How do you know that?" he asked in a broken voice. "Clairvoyance, Mr. Blensop. I seem to see, as I hold this pad, somebody writing upon it the combination for the information of another who had no right to have it. Somebody using a pencil with a hard lead, Mr. Blensop, which was very foolish of him, since it made a distinct impression on the undersheet. So you see my magic is rather colourless after all. Now a wiser man, Mr. Blensop, would have used a pen, a fountain pen by preference, with a soft gold nib, well broken. That would leave no impression. If you will lend me the beautiful pen I observe in your pocket, I will give you a further demonstration." The eyes of the secretary shifted wildly. He hesitated, moistened dry lips with the tip of a nervous tongue. "And don't try to get out of it, Mr. Blensop, because I am armed and don't mean to let you escape. Besides, that good Mr. Stone patrols the garden." Lanyard's tone changed to one of command. "That pen, monsieur?" Blensop's hand faltered to his waistcoat pocket, hesitated, withdrew and feebly extended the pen. "I think you are the devil," he stammered in an undertone. "The devil himself." Deftly unscrewing the pen point, Lanyard inverted the barrel above the desk. The cylinder of paper dropped out. "And now, Colonel Stanistreet, if you will call Mr. Stone and have this traitor removed." Chapter 23.
Of the False Faces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The False Faces by Louis Joseph Vance. When Stanistreet had gone out in company with Stone and the broken, weeping Blensop, ending a scene indescribably painful, a lull almost as uncomfortable to Lanyard ensued. Then, "How did you guess?" Cecelia Brooke asked in wonder. Discountenanced by the admiration glowing in her eyes, Lanyard stood fumbling with the disjointed members of Blensop's pen. "Do not give me too much credit," he depreciated. "Anybody acquainted with that roll of paper could have guessed that an empty fountain pen would furnish an ideal place of concealment for it. Moreover, just before you came in, that traitor missed his pen, and his consternation betrayed him beyond more doubt to one whose distrust was already astir. As for the other, it was true. Blensop did write down the combination on this pad, using a pencil with a hard lead. The marks are very plain. But for whose use? Ekstrom, Anderson, was here last night and saw Blensop alone. Colonel Stanistreet was not at home. Knowing what we know now, that Blensop was a creature of the German system here, bought body, soul and conscience through its studied pandering to his vices, we know he could not well have refused to surrender the combination on demand. Still, I fail to understand. Ekstrom, being Ekstrom, could not resist the opportunity to play double. Here was a property he could sell to England at a stiff price. Why not despoil the enemy, put the money in pocket, then return, steal the paper anew for the use of Germany, and collect the stipulated reward from that source? But he reckoned without Blensop's avarice there. He showed Blensop too plainly the way to profit through betraying both parties to a bargain. Blensop saw no reason why he should not play the game that Ekstrom played. So he stole it for himself to sell to Germany, but being a poor witless fool, lacking Ekstrom's dash and audacity, was foredoomed to failure and exposure. The girl continued to eye him steadfastly, and he as steadfastly to evade her direct gaze. Nothing that you could tell me detracts from the wonder of your guessing so accurately," she insisted. "Now I know what Mr. Crane said of you was true, that you are one of the most extraordinary of men." "He was too kind when he said that," Lanyard protested wretchedly. "It is not true. If you must know " "Well, Monsieur Lanyard?" Her tone was that of a light-hearted girl, arch with provocation. Of a sudden Lanyard understood that he might no longer stop here alone with her. "If you will be a little indulgent with me," he suggested, "I will try to explain what I mean." "And how indulgent, monsieur?" "I have a whim to take the air in this garden. Will you accompany me?" "Why not?" As she led the way through the French windows he noted with deeper misgivings how her action matched the temper of her voice, how she seemed today more deliciously alive and happier than any common mortal. So light her heart, and all since she had found him here. At his wits' ends, he conceded now what he had so long denied. With all her wit and wisdom, with all her charm of beauty, winsomeness and breeding, with all her ingrained love of truth and honesty, she was no more than nature had meant her to be, a woman with a woman's weakness for the man she must admire. She liked him, divined in him latent qualities somehow excellent. Something in him worked upon her imagination, something, no doubt, in the overcoloured romantic yarns current about the Lone Wolf, and so had touched her heart. She liked him too well already, and she was willing to like him better. But that must never be. He must rend ruthlessly apart this illusion of romance with which she chose to transfigure the prowling parasite of night, the sneaking thief. The garden was sweet with the bright promise of spring. A few weeks more and its formal walks would wind a riot of flowers. Now its sunlight made amends for what it lacked in beauty of growing things, and its air was warm and fragrant and still in the shelter of the red brick walls. Midway down that walk, by the side of which a thief had skulked 9 hours ago, near that door whose lock had yielded to his cunning keys, the girl paused and confronted Lanyard spiritedly as he came up with heavy step and hang-dog head. "Well, monsieur," she demanded, "do you mean to tantalize me longer with your reticence?" But something in the haggard eyes he showed her made the girl catch her breath. "What is it?" she cried anxiously. "Monsieur Duchemin, what is your trouble?" "Only this truth that I must tell you," he said bitterly. "I merely played a part back there just now. There was neither wit nor guesswork in that business. Once I had seen Blensop's panic over the fancied loss of his pen, the rest was knowledge. I saw him and Ekstrom together last night, skulking in those windows. I watched them. And though in my denseness I didn't understand, I saw him write upon that pad, tear off and give the sheet to Ekstrom. And I knew Ekstrom had not succeeded in stealing back what he had sold to Colonel Stanistreet, knew he was guiltless in fact if not in deed." "But how could you know that?" "Because I was there, in the room, when he entered it, after it had been shut up for the night." Conscious of her hands that fluttered like wounded things to her bosom, he looked away in misery. "What were you doing there?" she whispered in the end. "Trying to find that paper, which I had seen Ekstrom sell to Colonel Stanistreet, so that I might make good my promise and relieve your distress by returning it to you. I had opened the safe before he entered, and searched it thoroughly, and knew the paper was not there. Though at that time it never entered my head to suspect Blensop of treachery. It was neither Blensop nor Ekstrom, Miss Brooke. It was I who stole that necklace." She made no sound and did not stir. Though he dared not look, he knew her stricken gaze was steadfast to his face. "I will say this much in my defence. I did not come with the intent to steal, but only to take back what had been stolen from me and return it to you, who had trusted it to my care. I wanted to do that because I did not then understand the ins and outs of this intrigue, and had no means of knowing how deeply your honour might be involved." "But you did not take the necklace? I am sorry. I saw it and could not resist it." "But Mr. Crane assured me you had given up all that sort of thing years ago." "Notwithstanding that, it seems I may not be trusted." After another trying silence she declared vehemently: "I do not believe you. You say this thing for some secret purpose of your own. For some reason I can't understand you wish to abase yourself in my sight, to make me think you capable of such infamy. Why, ah, monsieur, why must you do this?" "Because it isn't fair to represent myself as what I am not, mademoiselle. Once a thief, always No, it isn't true. Again, I am sorry, but I know. You have been most generous to believe in me. If anything could save me from myself it would be your confidence. That, I presume, is why I called upon to undo my thieving and make good the loss. The money Colonel Stanistreet paid Ekstrom is now in the safe, back there in the library. The necklace is here." Blindly he thrust the tissue packet into her hands. "If you will consent to return it to its owner when I have gone, I shall be most grateful." Her hand shook so that when she opened the packet it escaped her grasp and dropped into a little pool of rain water which had collected in a hollow of the walk. Lanyard picked it up, stripped off the soiled and sodden paper, dried the necklace with his handkerchief, replaced it in her hand. He heard the deep intake of her breath as she recognized its beauty, then her quavering voice: "You give this back because of me?" "Because I cannot be an ingrate. I know no other way to prove how I have prized your faith in me. And now, with your leave, I will go away quietly by this garden gate. No, please no. But I have more to say to you. It isn't fair of you to go like this when I—" She interrupted herself, and when next she spoke he was dashed by a change in her voice from a tone of passionate expostulation to one of amused animation. "Colonel Stanistreet," she called clearly, "do come here at once, please." Startled, Lanyard saw that Stanistreet had appeared in the French windows in company with Crane. In response to Cecilia's hail both came out into the garden, Stanistreet briskly leading, Crane lounging at his heels, champing his cigar, his weathered features knitted against the brightness of the sun. "Good morning, Miss Brooke. Howdy, Lanyard. Are you de chemin again?" he said, but his salutations were lost in the wonder excited by the girl's next move. "See, Colonel Stanistreet, what we have found!" she cried, and showed him the necklace. "I mean what Monsieur Duchemin found. It was he who saw it lying beneath that rose bush over there. Your burglar must have dropped it in making his escape. You can see the paper he wrapped it in, all rain wet and muddied." Stanistreet's eyes protruded alarmingly, and his face grew very red before he found breath enough to ejaculate: "God bless my soul!" Breathing hard, he accepted the necklace from Cecilia's hands. "I must I must tell my sister in law about this immediately." He turned and trotted hastily back into the house. Crane lingered but a moment longer. His cheek, as ever, was bulging around his everlasting cigar. Was his tongue therein as well? Lanyard never knew. The man's eyes remained inscrutable for all the kindly shrewdness that glimmered amid their netted wrinkles. "Excuse me," he said suddenly, "I got to tell the colonel something." He got lankily into motion and presently passed in through the windows. Irresistibly her gaze drew Lanyard's. He lifted careworn eyes and realized her with a great wistfulness upon him. She awaited in silence his verdict, her chin proudly high, her face adorably flushed, her shining eyes level and brave to his, her generous hands outstretched. "Must you go now?" she said tenderly, as he stood hesitant and shamed. "Must you go now, my dear?" End of Chapter 23. End of The False Faces by Louis Joseph Vance.